I remember an old seer dropping a heavy truth on me once, telling me that the most lethal instrument ever weaponized against the black community in America wasn't the leather whip, the hangman's noose, or the chaotic spray of bullets. The ultimate weapon was a holy Bible that had been surgically altered with exactly 17 specific verses excised from the pages. You see, when you rip Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 68 out of the Sunday school lesson plan, while leaving verses 15 through 67 completely untouched, you manufacture a congregation that feels the heavy weight of a generational curse, but suffers from total amnesia regarding why they were scattered to the four winds. You essentially engineer a nation of believers who can shout hallelujah and preach sermons about escaping the bondage of Pharaoh in Egypt. They do this every single Resurrection Sunday, yet they go completely mute the moment you bring up the cargo ships. The overwhelming stench of brine mixed with human misery, the haunting rattle of iron shackles scraping against damp wood planks. We have taken 400 years of trauma and shrink-wrapped them into fuzzy felt-board stories and animated features, where ancient Africans look suspiciously like Hollywood actors from the 1950s. Now here is where I lose half the room. Donald Trump is not the antagonist in this specific script. That represents the plot twist that is probably going to make you want to close this browser window right now. But that reaction is by design too. Because if we accept the premise that Trump fits the biblical archetype of Gideon, then we are forced to ask the uncomfortable question that nobody in the pulpit wants to touch. If he is Gideon, then who represents Midian in the year 2026? And why on earth would the Most High select a man who posts on social media like a volatile adolescent, governs with the flair of a reality television producer, and splits the nation like a butcher's cleaver through bone just to bring about deliverance? Let me unearth something that has been intentionally buried under centuries of tradition. If you look at Judges chapter 6, Israel is indeed in bondage. But this isn't the slavery of Egypt, nor is it the captivity of Babylon. This is the suffocating oppression of Midian. For 7 long years, every single time the Israelites tried to get ahead and planted their crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites would descend upon the land like a plague of locusts, stripping the harvest bare, slaughtering the livestock, and forcing grown men to scurry into mountain crevices and caves for survival. The scriptures describe them swarming in with their cattle and tents, covering the ground effectively like an infestation of grasshoppers. They were an invasive species that left absolutely nothing behind. No sheep, no oxen, not even a donkey remained standing. The text in Judges 6 verse 6 says, Israel was brought to absolute destitution. We are talking about being brought very low. They weren't enslaved in the classical dungeon sense. They weren't all in physical chains, but they were being systematically bankrupted. It was a cycle of futility. Every time they built a structure, it was leveled. Every time they sowed a seed, the profit was hijacked before they could taste it. They had the capacity to work. They had the strength to labor. They could sweat and grind, but they were structurally forbidden from accumulating equity or wealth. Does that rhythm ring a bell? Because it absolutely should. We aren't just talking about biblical antiquity here. That is the story of Greenwood, Tulsa in 1921. That is Rosewood in 1923. That is every black Wall Street that ever drew breath before jealous mobs burned it to ash and cinder. That is the red ink on housing maps. That is the subprime lending trap. That is generational prosperity being siphoned off through legal frameworks that smile in your face while they extract the contents of your pockets. You have to understand that Midian was not Egypt. Egypt was brutal, back-breaking slavery, yes. But Egypt was strangely also a period of 400 years of demographic increase. Despite the whip of Pharaoh, the scripture confirms that the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied. The Egyptian machine couldn't stop the birthright. Egypt could not halt their expansion. But Midian was a different beast entirely. Midian was strategic, weaponized impoverishment, Midian was the system designed to let you punch the clock every day but ultimately confiscates the fruit of your labor. Midian represents the invisible hand that swipes your harvest in October and leaves you scratching your head wondering why you are still destitute by December. Now, pay close attention to this next part. The Almighty does not dispatch a Moses to handle the Midianite problem. Moses was tailored for Pharaoh. Moses was built for the brickyards, the whip-cracking taskmasters, and the parting of the Red Sea. Moses was the deliverer you send when the enemy is obvious, when the shackles are visible on your wrists, and when everyone can point to the oppression and agree on its name. But Midian required a completely different breed of leadership. It required someone unpredictable, someone deeply flawed. It required a leader that the polite society would question and reject. Someone whose own baggage and insecurity were so loud that when he finally executed the will of God, nobody could claim it was his moral excellence or confidence that saved the day. They would have no choice but to point to the Creator. When we meet Gideon, he is threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press. That is backward agriculture. You don't process wheat in a hole. You do it on a hilltop where the breeze can separate the chaff. A wine press is a pit. A wine press is a place of concealment. A wine press is where you go when you are terrified that the opposition is watching your bank account and waiting to seize your assets. Gideon was operating in the shadows because the Midianite system had conditioned him to hide his own productivity. The angel appears and calls this terrified man a mighty warrior, and Gideon's reaction is essentially, "You must be talking to the wrong guy." He literally argues with the divine. He demands receipts. He doesn't just ask for one sign, he demands 3 separate supernatural confirmations. He asks for a fleece to be wet, then dry, and finally for fire to blast out of a rock to consume his offering. Gideon requires proof stacked on top of proof because his faith has been fractured by 7 years of economic robbery and stolen harvests. And here is where the story gets volatile. God instructs Gideon to go tear down his father's altar to Baal. We aren't talking about the town square statue or the public monument. This is his father's altar, the generational shrine, the one in his own backyard, the idol, his bloodline built, maintained, and passed down as heritage. God tells him to execute this demolition at night because Gideon is petrified of his own family members and the city council. Gideon obeys, but barely. He does it under the cover of darkness with 10 servants helping him because he is shaking in his boots. When the locals wake up and see the wreckage the next morning, they form a lynch mob. These are his own neighbors, his own community members. They want to execute him for disrespecting the culture, for tearing down the altar that was part of their identity and tradition. Ironically, it is Gideon's father Joash who steps in to save him. Joash drops the ultimate logic on the mob, saying, "If Baal is truly a god, let him fight his own battles. If someone wrecked his altar, let the god himself handle the vandal. Stop trying to protect a deity that lacks the power to protect itself." Let's freeze the frame right there. Keep that mental picture locked in your mind. Imagine a man taking a sledgehammer to the very shrine his forefathers constructed, and his own neighbors are calling for his execution because of it. It isn't that they have some deep spiritual affection for Baal. It is because that shrine symbolizes order. It represents the status quo, the comfortable routine of how we do things around here. They cling to it even when that exact tradition is the reason their enemies, the Midianites, continue to raid their crops and starve them out year after year. Flash forward to 2016. Donald Trump didn't step onto the stage preaching polite conservatism or adhering to the unspoken rules of political etiquette. He didn't just knock on the door of the Republican establishment. He drove a bulldozer right through the front wall. He slaughtered the sacred cows. He called the invasion of Iraq a total fabrication. He declared that the Bush family dynasty had completely failed the American people. He even went after John McCain, a man considered untouchable because of his war record. He openly ridiculed the intelligence agencies and completely stepped over the heads of the mainstream media gatekeepers. He voiced the thoughts you are strictly forbidden from whispering in mixed company. 50% of the nation gave a standing ovation while the other 50% hyperventilated in shock. He wasn't polished, and he certainly didn't fit the mold of a president. He was a human demolition crew. And notice this, the first altar he smashed wasn't belonging to the liberals on the left. It was on the right. He came for the high place of neoconservatism. He attacked the shrine of perpetual foreign intervention and the global trade deals that gutted the American heartland, leaving the Rust Belt to rot. He struck the altar of political correctness, that unspoken rule that forbids you from actually identifying your adversary by name. The system tells you to refer to them as merely opposing viewpoints while they systematically dismantle your financial future line by line. But listen close, because here is the secret part they leave out of the history books. Gideon wasn't selected because his resume was impressive. He was picked because he said yes. God takes a fighting force of 32,000 soldiers and strips it down to a bare-bones crew of just 300 men. This wasn't because 300 special forces are better than a legion. It is because 300 is such a pathetic number that when they win, it is impossible for any man to pat himself on the back. No one can claim, "Our strategy achieved this." The only logical conclusion left is, the Almighty orchestrated this. The drastic reduction is the entire lesson. The vulnerability times is times the tactic. When Gideon's tiny band surrounds the massive Midianite encampment equipped with nothing but clay pots, torches, and horns, they don't even engage in hand-to-hand combat. They scream. They shatter the pottery. They blast the trumpets. And suddenly, the Midianites turn their swords on each other. The enemy eradicates the enemy, while Israel stands there and witnesses the implosion. Let me connect the dots for you so you see the spiritual blueprint. Trump's victory in 2016 defied every rule of the traditional ground game. It wasn't built on door-to-door canvassing or phone banks or the standard political infrastructure. It was fueled by tweets and massive stadium rallies. You had a complete outsider with 0 days of government service systematically dismantling 16 career Republican politicians during the primary season. Then he pivoted to defeat the most well-oiled, well-funded, and seemingly inevitable candidate the Democratic machine had ever produced. Hillary Clinton had the entire deck stacked in her favor. Every celebrity endorsement, every data analyst, every major strategist was on her payroll. Yet she lost the critical strongholds of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by a combined total of 77,000 votes. Think about that, 3 entire states flipped by the population of a mid-sized football stadium. The margin was razor thin. When the results came in, even Trump's inner circle was stunned into silence. That is not a victory of human planning. That is a Gideon-style intervention. That is the equivalent of 300 guys with noisemakers watching the opposition destroy itself from the inside out. But here is the pivot point where you need to lean in and listen. The narrative of Gideon doesn't fade to black with the defeat of Midian. It takes a dark turn. Once the dust settles, the men of Israel beg Gideon to take absolute power over them. They want a dynasty. They say, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson." Gideon turns them down flat. He declares, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son. The Lord alone will be your ruler." That is straight from Judges, chapter 8, verse 23. It sounds incredibly noble, doesn't it? It sounds like perfect humility. But read 3 verses further down. Gideon asks the people to throw in the gold earrings they stripped off the fallen Midianites. He takes that plunder, melts it down, and casts an ephod, a sacred priestly vest, and puts it on display in his hometown. The scripture is brutal here. All Israel played the harlot with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Do you see the cycle? Gideon starts by smashing his father's pagan altar. He liberates the nation from the enemy. He verbally refuses the crown, but then he manufactures a brand new idol that entraps his own bloodline. He shatters one generational curse, only to construct a fresh one with his own hands. He frees the people from physical slavery but leads them right into spiritual bondage. He is simultaneously the savior and the trap. Now look at the modern parallel. Donald Trump orchestrated the Abraham Accords, moved the United States Embassy to Jerusalem, and recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He positioned himself arguably as the single most pro-Israel commander-in-chief in the history of the Republic. Evangelical leaders anointed him with the title of a Cyrus figure, referencing the ancient pagan emperor god utilized to restore the Jewish state. Cyrus is explicitly named in Isaiah chapter 44 verse 28 and chapter 45 verse 1, prophecies written 2 centuries before the man was even born. God refers to him as my shepherd and my anointed. Even though Cyrus has no personal relationship with the God of Israel, he is an instrument, a blunt tool wielded for a specific divine purpose and then swept aside by the currents of history. Trump's tenure completely reshuffled the deck in the Middle East, setting the geopolitical stage for what many see as the final timeline of prophecy. Whether you worship the ground he walks on or despise him, that fact is undeniable. The critical question we must ask is this: what occurs after the dust of deliverance settles? What happens when the iconoclast who smashed the old altars decides to erect new ones in their place? What happens when the man who exposed the swamp's corruption becomes the focal point of a personality cult that is just as rigid and demanding as the system he claimed to destroy? This is the moment where things get strictly biblical, incredibly uncomfortable, and absolutely essential to understand. Gideon fathered 70 sons through various wives according to Judges chapter 8 verse 30. 70. That isn't a household. That is a tribe. That is a dynasty in everything but name. And despite his public refusal of the throne, he kept a concubine in Shechem who gave birth to a son named Abimelech, a name that literally translates to "my father is king." Let's break down the name Abimelech. In the Hebrew tongue, it literally translates to "my father is king." Right there, wrapped up in his identity, is a walking contradiction that screams hypocrisy. You see, Gideon stood before the people and publicly declared he would never be their king, yet he turned around and named his son, "My father is king." After Gideon passes, Abimelech heads straight to his mother's kinfolk in Shechem and sweet-talks them into handing him the crown. What follows is pure brutality. He takes 70 of his own brothers and slaughters 69 of them on a single stone. Understand this: that isn't warfare. That is a ritual sacrifice. That is a cold-blooded execution. He leaves only one survivor, Jotham, the youngest brother, who barely escapes with his life to deliver a prophetic parable that curses Abimelech's entire stolen reign. Abimelech manages to hold on to power for 3 years. Just 3 short years of tyranny. And then the scripture says God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the lords of Shechem. Read Judges chapter 9 verse 23. This wasn't a demon from hell. This wasn't Satan running loose. This was an evil spirit sent directly from God. The text does not stutter on this point. It is God himself who steps in to fracture the alliance. It is God who turns the hearts of the people against the very leader they begged for. The city of Shechem rises up in rebellion. In retaliation, Abimelech burns the entire city to the ground. Then, hungry for more destruction, he marches on to the next town, Thebez. But just as he is preparing to torch the strong tower where the civilians are taking shelter, a woman from the rooftop drops a heavy millstone squarely on his head and cracks his skull open. Even as he is dying, Abimelech's pride is still intact. He calls out to his armor-bearer and orders him to run him through with a sword, just so history cannot record that a woman took him out. Even while taking his last breath, he is obsessed with his brand, his reputation, and his legacy. This is the essence of the Gideon cycle. The Most High raises up a deeply flawed man to break the chains of oppression. The man obeys, kicking and screaming the whole way, and God grants a supernatural victory. The people, in their gratitude, try to crown him. He refuses the title with his mouth, but accepts the authority with his actions. He begins to build new systems of control. His children inherit the spiritual rot. The nation fractures down the middle, and within a single generation, the glorious deliverance becomes the foundation for the next catastrophe. Now let's flip that script and bring it to modern America. If Donald Trump is a modern-day Gideon, we have to ask the hard question: who truly benefits from his presidency? I'm not talking about partisan talking points. I'm not asking if black unemployment numbers shifted. I am talking about a kingdom perspective. We need to look at what spiritual altars were torn down and which ones were erected in their place. Trump absolutely exposed the deep state machinery. He called out the lying media. He challenged the globalist trade agreements that were draining the country. He stood tall against unchecked borders. He put conservative judges on the bench. He slashed taxes. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. These are facts. They are documented. But at the same time, he blew up the national debt by $7.8 trillion. He left Afghanistan in a state of absolute disaster. He mishandled the pandemic response. He could not quell the riots burning down our cities. He lost the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House all within a 4-year span. And on January 6, 2021, the people who were convinced he was God's anointed stormed the Capitol because they could not process that their deliverer's season had expired. This isn't just politics. This is a spiritual autopsy of a nation. Because if the story of Gideon teaches us anything, it is that deliverance and deception can flow from the exact same faucet. God is fully capable of using a broken vessel to smash an oppressive system, and that same vessel can turn around and construct a new trap for the people. The Israelites were not wrong to cheer for Gideon's victory over Midian, but they were dead wrong to turn him into an idol. Their mistake was placing their trust in the man rather than in the God who sent the man. And when Gideon's golden ephod became a snare, when Abimelech massacred his own brothers, when the nation spiraled back into chaos, the people had nobody to blame but the face in the mirror. They traded the oppression of the Midianites for the tyranny of Abimelech because they were desperate for a king. They wanted a strong man. They wanted a savior figure to fix their problems so they wouldn't have to do the hard work of repenting. Let that sink deep into your spirit, because this is the moment where black people need to wake up. We aren't talking about Democrat versus Republican. We are talking about recognizing the prophetic pattern. Gideon was not raised up to save the whole world. He was raised up specifically to save Israel. When the tribe of Ephraim got offended that Gideon didn't invite them to the war, he had to massage their egos with flattery just to keep the peace. When the men of Succoth and Penuel refused to feed his soldiers during the pursuit, he circled back after the win and slaughtered them. Gideon was tribal to his core. He was flawed. He was reactive. He was exactly the type of rough instrument God uses when the people refuse to listen to the priests or the prophets. When a people are so crushed by oppression that they need spiritual shock therapy, that is when God deploys a Gideon. It's not because Gideon is a saint, but because Gideon is crazy enough to tear down the altar of Baal, even when he is shaking in his boots. So here is the critical question that Black America needs to wrestle with right now. If Trump is indeed a Gideon figure sent to deliver Israel from Midian, then who represents Israel in this equation? Because, family, it is not black people. Trump's base is overwhelmingly the white working-class evangelical heartland of America. Those are the folks filling up the rallies. That is who marched on the Capitol. That is who flies the flags, wears the red hats, and believes with all their heart that he is the chosen one. If he is Gideon, his assignment was to deliver times his times people from times their times Midian. And we have to identify who their Midian is. Their Midian is the globalist elite, the tech oligarchs, the media giants, and the political establishment that shipped their factories overseas, flooded their communities with opioids, and told them their culture was trash. Trump handed them the torches, the jars, and the trumpets. He gave them the permission to roar. He gave them a target they could put a name to. And when he won, they watched their Midian crumble, or at least crack enough for them to feel like God was finally listening. But for us, for black people, we were never part of that specific deliverance story. We were never really the main characters in that story. We were just the casualties on the periphery. We stood on the sidelines of a spiritual war zone watching a prophetic drama written by people who didn't look like us unfold in real time. Some of us got so caught up in the pyrotechnics, so starving for a disruption of the status quo, that we drank the Kool-Aid. We talked ourselves into believing that Donald Trump was our biblical deliverer, our modern-day Gideon sent to shatter the establishment. But let me be clear, he was not that man then, and he certainly is not that man now. We need to stop looking at their stage and start looking in our own mirror. The real question, the only one that holds weight for us in 2026, is simple. Where is our times, Gideon? Where is the imperfect, shaking, unlikely vessel that the Most High is raising up from the mud right now? Who is the one commissioned to smash our specific idols and break the yoke of our specific Midian? Because make no mistake, we are dealing ardors with our own oppressors. We are facing systems designed to let us till the ground but forbid us from eating the fruit. We are trapped in engineered cycles of poverty where the finish line keeps moving further away every time we get close. Scripture talks about a 7-year oppression, but we are looking at a captivity that has been running for 4 centuries and counting. The clock has been ticking a lot longer for us. If the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he is then, he is not sending us a media-ready, polished politician that everyone loves. He is going to drop someone in our midst who causes arguments at the dinner table. He will send a disruptor who terrifies us because they have the audacity to take a sledgehammer to the sacred cows we have spent generations protecting. Let us look at the biblical calculus. After Gideon broke the back of Midian, he judged Israel for 40 years. According to Judges chapter 8 verse 28, they had 4 decades of peace, 1 single generation of quiet. But the moment Gideon died, the fabric tore. Enter Abimelech and his 3-year reign of absolute terror. You read through Judges chapter 9 and see the spiral. Tola judged for 23 years. Jair followed for 22 years. But then the Ammonites crushed Israel for 18 long, hard years. By the time we arrive at Judges chapter 11, the people are back in chains, screaming out to heaven. But this time, the response from the throne room is enough to freeze your blood. The Lord essentially tells them, "Go scream at the idols you picked over me. Let those foreign gods save you when the heat gets turned up." That is Judges chapter 10, verse 14. God is fed up. He is tired of the cycle. He rescued them through Gideon, and the minute the pressure was off, they ran right back to Baals and the Ashtaroth. So when the cries go up again, God folds his arms and says, "You made your choice. You wanted those deities. Let's see what they can do for you now." The first generation saw the chains break. The second generation watched the world burn in chaos. By the third generation, the oppression was heavier than it had ever been before. That is the historical rhythm. If we are buying into the theory that Trump was some sort of second coming of Gideon, then folks, we are way past the deliverance stage. We are living in the Abimelech timeline. We are in the ugly chapter where the offspring of the so-called deliverer are knifing each other for a seat on the throne. We are watching the people who were supposed to be liberated shatter into 1,000 warring tribes all over again. The threat is no longer coming from across the border. It is coming from the mirror. It is a spirit of fratricide and division, where we worship personalities instead of standing on principles. It is a stubborn refusal to turn back because repentance requires a confession that we were deceived. We built a golden calf out of a mortal man. We idolized a political movement. We worshipped a fleeting moment in time. And now, as the judgment stone comes crashing down, our pride has glued our feet to the floor. Understand this, the issue isn't even about Donald Trump anymore. It never really was. He is just a polished surface reflecting our own ugliness back at us. He is simply illuminating the pagan altars we have been hiding in our basements, the ones handed down to us by our fathers and our grandfathers. The altar of American arrogance. The shrine of blind party loyalty, the false hope of salvation through a ballot box. We bow at the altar that suggests if we just vote hard enough, march loud enough, or craft the perfect viral post, we can fix a spiritual condition that only the hand of God can dismantle. Remember, Gideon tore down the altar of Baal, but then he turned around and crafted a golden ephod that became a snare and a trap for his entire lineage. We have done the exact same thing. We dismantled the old plantations but built new institutions that look progressive but enslave just as effectively. We tore down Confederate statues but kept the private prison industry booming. We marched across bridges for civil rights, but then we settled for a watered-down civil religion that demands nothing of our souls. We shouted Black Lives Matter in the streets, but we refused to go into the prayer closet and ask the God of our ancestors, "Lord, what do you say? What do you require of us?" We didn't ask what idolatry in my own living room needs to be smashed in the dark of night before I am even qualified to identify the enemy. But here is the secret they left out of Sunday school. Gideon's 300 men didn't just show up blowing horns. They carried fire hidden inside clay pitchers. The illumination was concealed until the precise second of the ambush. When the command came and they smashed those jars, the darkness was instantly pierced. 300 blazing points of fire encircled the camp seemingly out of nowhere. The Midianites jolted awake, convinced they were surrounded by a legion of thousands. Panic hijacked their minds. In the confusion, they started slaughtering one another. They ran for their lives. Gideon's crew didn't even have to draw a blade in that initial assault. The enemy cannibalized itself. Understand the symbology. The jar represents the vessel, the flesh, our perceived limitations and our obscurity. The torch is the anointing, the divine purpose, the Holy Ghost fire locked inside ordinary folks. And the breaking. That is the critical moment when the outer shell is shattered so the glory can escape. You cannot have the illumination without the fragmentation. There is no victory without the violent sacrifice of the container. Those 300 men had to destroy the very thing that was protecting their flame. They had to be willing to smash their own shields. They had to embrace total vulnerability to become truly dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. And this is the Gideon revelation for Black America. We are not called to be Gideon. We are the 300. We are the ones standing in the dark, clutching fire inside cheap clay pots, waiting for the order to shatter. But the breaking scares us to death because the jar is all we have ever known. The jar has become our identity. The jar is our security blanket. The jar is the narrative the world has spun about who we are, what our value is, and how high we are permitted to climb. The jar is the layer upon layer of generational trauma we have wrapped around our spirits so tight and so thick that we actually forgot we were carrying the fire of God the whole time. And right now, the Most High is issuing a directive that shakes the very foundations of our reality. Shatter the clay vessel. Release the hidden fire. Let the adversaries be blinded by the sudden brilliance. Let panic set in until they are consuming one another in their confusion. Understand this, you are not called to wage this war with conventional weapons or physical swords. This is a war of revelation fought with the weapon of exposure, wielding a truth so piercing and a light so intense that the darkness has no choice but to feed on its own flesh. Look at what happened with Donald Trump. He took the clay jar of political correctness and Washington decorum and smashed it on the floor. He didn't just play the game. He exposed the entire rigged nature of the casino. He completely disintegrated the carefully crafted illusion that the American system was functioning for the benefit of the citizenry rather than the enrichment of the ruling class. And listen, whether you view him as a hero or a villain is irrelevant to this point. You cannot deny that the illumination he brought triggered a cascade of chaos, genuine, irreversible, systemic chaos that we are still navigating in 2026. The corporate media complex has been stripped of its authority. The intelligence community has lost its cloak of infallibility. The Republican establishment has seen its internal unity pulverized into dust. The Democratic machine has watched its ironclad grip on the minority vote crumble away. Institutions that stood for decades as untouchable monoliths are now being interrogated and dismantled before our very eyes. And yes, in the midst of that swirling storm, there was collateral damage. Good people were hurt, direction was lost, and many fell into the trap of idol worship. But the undeniable fact remains: the light was released, and the hidden things were made plain. Once the curtain is pulled back, you cannot unsee the wizard. But we must talk about the price tag. Gideon's revolutionary act cost him his household. He lost his 70 sons, and his legacy was tainted in blood. The ephod he constructed in victory became a spiritual snare for his people. The peace he fought so hard to secure barely survived his own lifetime before evaporating. And the son who bore his name, Abimelech, twisted that legacy into tyranny and murder. Deliverance always comes with a steep invoice, and history shows us that the liberator rarely gets to retire peacefully in the land they fought to free. Moses never tasted the fruits of Canaan. David was forbidden from constructing the temple. Gideon failed to build a righteous dynasty that could outlast him. Their job was demolition and groundbreaking. They cleared the heavy brush. They smashed the pagan altars. But the habitation of the promised land was always reserved for the generation that followed. And that next generation is always faced with the ultimate binary choice. Will they honor the blood sacrifice of their predecessors, or will they loop back around and repeat the same catastrophic errors? So if you are a Black American watching this breakdown and asking yourself, how does ancient history or modern politics apply to my life? Let me give you the raw truth. It applies to every single aspect of your existence. The Gideon paradigm is the biblical blueprint, the divine algorithm for how God orchestrates the liberation of an oppressed demographic using deeply flawed leadership during the chaotic shift between eras. Make no mistake, we are living through a massive transition. The old world order is gasping its last breath, and the new epoch is struggling to be born right here in 2026. We are stuck in the gray zone, that liminal space, where logic seems to fail, where everyone is retreating into tribal corners, where old altars are being bulldozed, and strange new idols are being erected in their place. It creates a crisis of trust because the supposed deliverer often mimics the traits of the oppressor. Meanwhile, the oppressor is citing Bible verses, and the prayers of your grandmother are crashing violently against the militant rage of your modern activism. And there you stand, holding a torch concealed inside a clay jar, paralyzed, waiting for a voice from the sky to tell you when to smash it open. But you need to realize the command isn't coming in the future because the Most High already spoke it. You missed it because you were expecting a thunderclap from Mount Sinai, not a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The command sounded like deafening silence. It sounded like the slamming of every door you tried to open, every career opportunity that was blocked, every reliable support system collapsing, every leader selling you out, and every social movement splintering into ego-driven factions. God is methodically stripping away every crutch you thought would rescue you, so that when you finally shatter that jar, you will have zero doubt that it wasn't political maneuvering, economic theory, or viral fame that saved you. It was the sovereign God working through your absolute weakness, utilizing the foolish things of this world to utterly confuse the so-called wise and powerful. He is working through a remnant of 300 nobodies, people the world wrote off who are willing to carry fire in fragile, breakable vessels, waiting for that split second when vulnerability transforms into total victory. So stop debating if Trump is the modern Gideon. That's the wrong conversation. The critical question is whether you have the guts to be one of the 300. Are you willing to grip that torch even when staying hidden in the jar feels safer? Can you stand in the pitch black, surrounded by an enemy that vastly outnumbers you? Are you ready to hold a light that instantly marks you as a target, standing still until the signal is given to break? Because when those jars finally explode, when 300 distinct points of fire blaze up simultaneously in the dead of night, the enemy won't see just 300 soldiers. Their fear will make them see 30,000. They will hallucinate 300,000. They will perceive the invincible armies of the living God bearing down on them. And in that panic, they will destroy each other. You won't even have to lift a finger in violence. Your job is simply to shine. That is the parallel. That is the prophetic strategy. This is what Black America needs to grasp deeply. The Trump presidency wasn't designed for our salvation, but the disruption it caused, the pattern it unveiled, that is for us. The chaos that has been unleashed is actually clearing the construction site for something entirely new. We are talking about a restoration that cannot occur until the archaic structures are exposed. The mass illusions are dissolved, the clay jars are shattered, and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. We are not sitting around waiting for a politician to save us. We are not holding our breath for a reparations check from a bankrupt system. We are not waiting for the United States to issue a tearful apology. We are waiting for the realization of the order we already possess. Break the jar. Let the fire blaze. Stop concealing your brilliance in the winepress of fear. Stop trying to thresh your wheat in the shadows where nobody can see you. Stop being paralyzed by the terror that if you step into your true calling, your own community will try to destroy you. Remember, Gideon's own neighbors wanted to execute him for tearing down their idol. The people closest to you might reject you for destroying their sacred cows. Do it anyway. Because that demonic altar is the specific reason Midian keeps raiding your harvest every single season. And until you summon the courage to demolish what your fathers built in their compromise, you will never possess the strength to build what your children require for their freedom. This is only part 2, and we are preparing to go much deeper into the reality of what these altars actually represent in our modern context. Because the altar Gideon wrecked wasn't just a pile of wood and stone. It was a mindset, a psychological stronghold, and a spiritual belief system. It is the ultimate deception, the lie that whispers you can serve two masters without consequence. It is the belief that you can bow before the God of Abraham on Sunday morning and then hedge your bets with pagan idols for the rest of the week. It is the audacity to claim a holy covenant while actively practicing syncretism. And let us be clear about what syncretism is. It is the blending of oil and water, the mixing of incompatible belief systems into a toxic spiritual stew. This is not a new strategy. It is the oldest hustle in the enemy's playbook. The adversary does not need you to become an atheist. That requires too much effort. He does not ask you to renounce God completely. No, the trick is far more subtle. You just have to add an appendix to the Almighty. You do not have to reject the scripture. You simply have to twist it, dilute it, and reinterpret it until it accommodates your sin. You do not have to abandon your identity. You just have to fracture it. The system wants you to be one version of yourself in the sanctuary and a completely different animal when you clock in at the office. It demands that you wear one mask when you are kicking it with your black friends and a totally different sanitized mask when you are navigating spaces with your white colleagues. You become a shapeshifter, righteous when it is safe and ruthless when it is profitable. But here is the danger. If you split your soul enough times, eventually you will look in the mirror and have no idea which face is actually yours. Let's look at the history. Baal was the Canaanite god of the economy. He controlled fertility, rain, and prosperity. Worshipping Baal was not just spiritual, it was strictly business. Baal was the one who brought the harvest. Baal was the one who made it rain. Baal was the stock market bull that guaranteed the wealth. And when you are living under 7 years of crushing Midianite oppression, when your crops are being stolen and your livestock is dying in the field, the temptation is to cover every single base. You think I will pray to Yahweh for my soul's salvation, but I better slide an offering to Baal for next quarter's revenue just to be safe. Here is the conflict. Yahweh demands holiness, obedience, and exclusive devotion. Baal demands a sacrifice, but he promises immediate, tangible results. Yahweh makes promises that last for generations. Baal makes promises that are purely transactional. And when your stomach is touching your back, a transaction today feels a lot safer than a legacy for your grandchildren. That right there is the altar standing in the Black community in 2026. We do not have a literal golden statue in the living room, but we harbor the arrogant belief that we can worship the Most High and simultaneously worship Mammon. We fool ourselves into thinking we can be kingdom people while we break our necks chasing validation from the empire. We sing songs about Zion on Sunday, then pledge our full allegiance to Babylon on Monday morning. We stand in the pulpit preaching liberation theology, all while draping ourselves in platinum chains and designer labels that we call fashion, but are really just expensive shackles. We love to talk about the resilience of our ancestors, yet we have abandoned the very disciplines that kept them breathing: fervent prayer, fasting, the Sabbath rest, and true interdependence. We have made a terrible swap. We traded the altar of the Holy Covenant for the altar of ruthless capitalism. We traded the altar of the family unit for the altar of hyper-individualism. We traded the favor of God for the approval of a system that was never designed to love us. And the tragedy is, we convinced ourselves it wasn't idolatry. We told ourselves it was just strategy. We told ourselves we were being wise, that we were just playing the game, that code switching was necessary for survival. But Gideon's story exposes the lie. Survival strategies morph into generational curses when you forget they were only meant to be temporary measures. The wine press was a temporary hideout. Gideon was supposed to thresh wheat there just long enough to survive the raid, not build a condo there. But if the Midianites had stayed in power for another 7 years, Gideon's children would have grown up thinking that hiding in a hole was normal behavior. They would have been raised to believe that hiding was wisdom. They would have confused fear with faith. And if a prophet finally came along and said, "God wants you to thresh on the hilltop where the wind blows free," they would have called that man reckless. They would have called him dangerous. They would have labeled him a threat to the community because the winepress had become their altar, the thing they defended, the thing they worshipped, and the thing they would kill to protect. That is exactly what Gideon faced when he tore down his father's altar to Baal. He was not just smashing wood and stone. He was violently challenging the community's entire definition of safety and security. He was screaming a hard truth. The God we have been worshiping alongside Yahweh is the very reason we are still in chains. The thing you think is protecting us is actually the thing that is cursing us, and the people wanted to execute him for it. Not because they loved Baal more than Yahweh, but because that altar represented certainty in an uncertain world. It represented control. It gave them something to do with their hands when they felt completely powerless against their oppressors. Yahweh required blind faith. Baal required a ritual. And when you have no power, a ritual feels like you are doing something. Black America has erected altars that function the exact same way. Look at the altar of higher education. We are sold a bill of goods that says, if we just get the degree, master the King's English and code switch with perfection, we will finally be free. But then we graduate with $100,000 in student loan debt, only to discover that a PhD does not stop you from being followed in a luxury store, pulled over by the police, or passed over for the C-suite. The altar promised us liberation. The altar delivered a different, more expensive kind of bondage. Yet we keep feeding our children to that machine because we simply do not know what else to do. We keep believing the lie that if we just get a better degree from a more prestigious university, maybe then the magic will work. Maybe then we will be safe. Maybe then they will accept us. And every generation that exhausts itself climbing the ladder eventually discovers that the ladder is leaning against a burning building. But instead of questioning the altar, we internalize the failure. We tell ourselves we didn't hustle hard enough. We didn't assimilate well enough. We blame our own performance, and the altar remains standing untouched. Look at the altar of integration. We were told that if we could just sit at the same lunch counters, attend the same schools, and move into the same subdivisions, the curse would finally lift. But we learned the hard way that integration without reparations is nothing more than the redistribution of trauma. We fought tooth and nail to get into their classrooms only to abandon the educators who truly loved and understood our children. We moved into their zip codes and completely forgot the neighbors who once had our backs. We surrendered our own economic power just to spend money in theirs. Let's be clear about history. Black Wall Street did not fall because we were separated. It collapsed because of white supremacy. But instead of laying new bricks to build a second empire, we chose to integrate. We scattered to the wind. We ran toward whiteness like it was a shield, convincing ourselves that standing next to them would finally keep us safe. Now, in the year 2026, we are spread thin across quiet cul-de-sacs and gentrified city centers, completely cut off from our power base, sitting in rooms where we are barely tolerated and never truly empowered. And we have the nerve to call it progress. We label it making it. We think moving to the good neighborhood and getting into the top-tier school is the prize. But the reality is our children are strangers to their own bloodlines. They can't tell you where they come from. They don't know the spirituals, the secret family recipes, the survival codes, or the prayers that kept their ancestors alive. But they can quote every brand name. They are experts on every viral trend hitting the timeline. They have mastered the art of code switching to keep white folks comfortable, yet they are completely illiterate when it comes to their own soul. That is the steep price we paid for worshiping at the altar of integration without ever demanding a receipt for what was stolen. We traded our heritage for the altar of celebrity. We lift up individuals and mistake it for the empowerment of the tribe. We look at the hip-hop billionaire, the NBA superstar, or the Hollywood icon, and we trick ourselves into believing their personal bank account lifts the entire community. We live vicariously through their heavy chains, their red carpet influence, and their mainstream visibility. But let me tell you, one person breaking through the glass ceiling is not the same as the whole community rising up. One person getting a folding chair at the table is not the same as us building our own dining hall. And the moment that celebrity slips up, sells their soul, or says something to appease the establishment, we are emotionally wrecked. We feel personally backstabbed because we anointed them as our high priests. We made them the middleman for our dreams. We placed the entire weight of our hope on their shoulders. When they inevitably show us they are just flawed human beings, compromised by the system, we are left empty-handed because we trusted the vessel instead of the potter. We worshiped the talent and ignored the creator who gave it. Every time we do this, we are just giving Baal a remix and a new logo. You need to open your Bible and look at that verse again. Go to Judges chapter 6, verse 25. The Most High commands Gideon to take the second bull, the 7-year-old one, and demolish his father's shrine to Baal and to cut down the Asherah pole standing next to it. But he didn't stop there. He said, take that specific wood, the very timber used for idolatry, and use it to fuel a burnt offering to Yahweh. That instruction is incredibly precise. God could have demanded fresh lumber for a holy fire, but he said, no, use the wood from the idol. Take the infrastructure of false worship and set it on fire for the one true God. It is about redeeming the raw materials, sanctifying the resources. He isn't saying just smash the old system. He is saying transform it. Take what was evil and repurpose it for righteousness. That is the prophetic mandate for Black America right now. The Creator isn't telling us to walk away from everything we have built. He is telling us to dismantle the idols and repurpose the bricks. Get that degree, but use the knowledge to free your people, not to assimilate into the system. Get that money, but use it to buy land and build legacy, not just to stack up generational consumer debt. Take the influence, but use it to shield the community rather than fleeing from it. You take the very weapons the enemy formed against you and burn them as an offering to the kingdom. That is how you flip a curse into a blessing. You don't reject the resource. You sanctify what is redeemable, and you destroy what is wicked. But pay attention to the silence in the text. When Gideon wrecks that altar, the townspeople want his head on a platter, and God does not send down lightning to stop them. There is no angelic bodyguard dispatched. God does not strike the mob dead. The breaking of chains is not a theory. It is dangerous work. It has a real body count. It has a list of names. It has dates you can verify in the archives. Look at May 31st, 1921. The Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 35 city blocks turned to charcoal. Over 1,200 homes incinerated. 40 square blocks of black sovereignty, black economic power, and black independence wiped off the map in less than 24 hours. The newspapers claimed only 36 people died. We know the truth is closer to 300 souls. Bodies were dumped in trenches, thrown into the Arkansas River, and hidden in unmarked graves that we wouldn't find for another 80 years. And the spark for this inferno, a 19-year-old shoe shiner named Dick Rowland allegedly stepping on a white elevator operator's toe. Or maybe he stumbled. Maybe she screamed, maybe she didn't. The narrative shifted to fit the lie they needed to tell, but the outcome was absolute destruction. White mobs were instantly deputized by the police. They dropped turpentine bombs from private airplanes onto black rooftops. They set up machine gun nests, dragged our men behind vehicles, and torched churches with the deacons still praying inside. When the smoke finally lifted and the dead were tallied, the city didn't offer aid to Greenwood. They brought in bulldozers. They redrew the zoning maps. They passed laws making it illegal for those black families to rebuild on their own ashes. They didn't just steal the harvest, they poisoned the soil so nothing would ever grow there again. That is the spirit of Midian. That is strategic, calculated impoverishment. Do not confuse this with slavery. In slavery, you are property, so they keep you alive to work. This is extermination economics. This is a demonic system that looks at black prosperity and says, if we cannot control it, we must annihilate it. And if we destroy it thoroughly enough, they will suffer from amnesia and forget they were ever kings. But this is exactly where the prophecy begins. The miracle of Greenwood, Tulsa didn't happen by accident. It existed because our ancestors grasped a revelation from the story of Gideon's 300 that we have completely lost sight of in 2026. They possess the deep wisdom that you cannot sit around waiting for your oppressor to sign a permission slip for you to prosper. You have to construct a parallel kingdom. You establish your own financial institutions, stock your own markets, build your own theaters, print your own truth in newspapers, educate your own children, and heal your bodies in your own hospitals. They understood the velocity of money, keeping a single dollar circulating within the neighborhood 18 distinct times before it ever crossed the tracks to the other side, 18 times. That is not integration. That is strategic insulation. That is economic warfare and self-defense. That represents the clay jar concealing the burning torch inside. And when that clay jar was shattered, when the smoke rose over Greenwood, the true fire was finally exposed for the world to witness. The entire nation stared in shock at what black excellence looks like when it is undistracted and left to its own devices. And let me tell you, that sight struck terror into their hearts because they did the math. If these people could construct one black Wall Street in Oklahoma, they could replicate it 100 times over from Chicago to Atlanta. And if they established 100 sovereign economies, they would no longer require validation, capital, or sanction from the establishment. They would be truly liberated. We are talking about actual sovereignty. And sovereign liberty is the one variable the spirit of Midian cannot stomach. So they scorched the earth, and they have been scorching it every single day since. They stopped using biplanes and dynamite and switched to fountain pens and legislation, using redlining maps, predatory subprime lending, and the calculated displacement called gentrification. They wage war through the mass incarceration complex, the pipeline turning classrooms into cell blocks, nutritional wastelands in our hoods, and medical apartheid. It is environmental racism, and every single zoning law or ordinance that dictates you may reside here, but you are forbidden from ownership. You are welcome to labor here, but you will not build wealth here. You can exist in this space, but you cannot accrue equity in this space. That is the classic Midianite playbook found in the scriptures. Let them sow the seeds. Let them break their backs in the field. Let them sweat blood, and then the moment the harvest is ripe, swarm in like locusts and strip the land bare. And here is the heartbreaking reality we have to face. The church has been an accomplice to the crime. I need to be crystal clear. The Black Church, the very institution designed to be our fortress and firewall against this systemic wickedness, has transformed into an altar for the enemy. Not every assembly, not every leader, but far too many to ignore. We have an abundance of pastors peddling the prosperity gospel while the people in the pews drown in generational debt and financial ruin. We have worship leaders shucking and jiving for white evangelical approval while their own neighborhoods are being evicted and gentrified out of existence. We see bishops constructing massive auditoriums that hold 5,000 souls, yet they lack a single credit union, a financial literacy curriculum, or a strategy to buy back the block. We have enough preachers telling folks to just pray away the systemic oppression, yet they never organize a movement to dismantle the system itself. Academics argue over Calvinism versus Arminianism while completely ignoring the curses of Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 playing out in real time before their eyes. It is an endless cycle of conferences, concerts, book launches, and ego-driven brand management masquerading as kingdom ministry. The sanctuary became the altar of compromise. And we defend these broken systems just like the men of that ancient city defended Baal. It isn't because we love the corruption. It is because we are terrified of who we would be without the familiar religious structure holding us up. This is where the rubber meets the road. Gideon's own father, Joash, was the custodian of the altar to Baal. Judges chapter 6, verse 25 makes it undeniable. It was your father's altar, not the town square's altar, Joash's personal shrine. This means Joash, a covenant man, a blood descendant of Abraham, a man who knew the law, constructed and maintained a monument to a demonic deity. And he didn't hide it in a basement. It was right there in his backyard. It was so public that the moment Gideon demolished it, the entire town knew exactly whose property had been violated. Joash wasn't a secret sinner. He was openly living a double life. He was practicing syncretism in broad daylight, worshiping the God of Israel and bowing to Baal. He would offer prayers at the tabernacle and then burn incense to the goddess Asherah, and the community said nothing because the community was complicit. Everyone was doing it. The compromise was cultural. The idolatry was standard operating procedure. It required God stepping in to confront Gideon, who was hiding in a wine press paralyzed by fear, to finally snap the chain. That is precisely where we stand today. The compromise is collective. The idolatry is accepted. The high places are built in the backyards of our most respected elders and leaders, the ones we are trained never to challenge. And the Most High is scanning the horizon for someone who is sufficiently exhausted, broken, and desperate, enough to smash the idol in the dead of night, even if it means their own kinfolk want to execute them the next morning. That is the assignment. That is the price of admission. That is the specific frequency of obedience that unlocks supernatural deliverance. We aren't talking about obedience that seeks a committee vote. We aren't talking about obedience that asks for a permission slip. We aren't talking about obedience that runs a risk assessment and decides the danger is too great. We are talking about the obedience that moves in the shadows with 10 loyal associates and a sacrificial bull simply because God gave the order and his word is final. Pay close attention to the fallout. Gideon executes the mission. He destroys the altar. The town mob assembles and demands his head on a platter, but then Joash, the very man who built the shrine, steps in to defend his son. Joash declares, "Are you going to fight Baal's battles? Are you going to save a god? Anyone who fights for him dies by sunrise. If he is truly a god, let him fight his own battles when his altar is toppled." That is Judges 6 verse 31. Joash flipped the script. The architect of the idol became the defense attorney for the iconoclast. Why? Because when the altar was reduced to rubble and Baal failed to strike Gideon down, Joash had an epiphany. The deity he had been serving was impotent. The system he defended couldn't even defend itself. The altar he built for safety had yielded him nothing but chains. And consider his son, the very one he likely dismissed as soft, the boy who probably kept him up at night with worry over his future. The same young man who was beating out wheat in the bottom of a wine press, hiding in the shadows out of sheer terror, actually possessed a reservoir of grit and courage that outweighed the bravery of the entire city put together. That moment of realization didn't just shake Joash, it shattered his worldview and woke his spirit up from a long slumber. This right here is the specific word that our elders and the gatekeepers of the Black community desperately need to receive. You need to understand that your children are not acting in rebellion against you when they start dismantling the shrines you erected. On the contrary, they are walking in direct obedience to God. Now, if those altars you constructed were built out of necessity, for compromise, for mere survival, for navigating a crooked system designed to wipe you out, that is completely understandable. That is a deeply human response to trauma. That is simply the brutal reality of existing in the land of Midian, whether you have been captive for 7 years, 70 years, or 400 years. You did exactly what you had to do to stay breathing. You built those altars to ensure there was food on the table. You established those traditions to keep your offspring from being killed in the streets. You created those monuments of appeasement just to keep the enemy from looking in your direction. But you have to see the cost. Those very same altars are the reason your grandchildren are still walking around in spiritual chains. Those monuments are the reason the harvest continues to be pilfered before you can even enjoy it. Those sacred cows you are protecting are the specific reason we are still hiding in wine presses, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff in the dark. And listen closely, if your child happens to be the instrument God has anointed to smash those idols, your assignment is not to stand guard over the altar. Your divine assignment is to do exactly what Joash did. Step out of the way. Let the false god Baal fight his own battles. Let the system defend itself if it is so powerful. And when Baal fails to show up, when the altar crumbles into dust, and lightning does not strike, when the heavens do not open up with judgment, and the only shift in the atmosphere is that your family is finally liberated, admit the truth. Just admit you were mistaken. Confess that the altar was actually a generational curse, disguised as safety. Admit that your child possessed the spiritual vision you lacked, and then you stand up and fight for them, because the men of the establishment are on their way. The religious gatekeepers are coming for them. The entire terrified community is marching toward your house. And make no mistake, they will want your child's blood for daring to expose the lies that everyone else was too petrified to speak aloud. The date on the calendar is far more significant than the names involved. Look at November 8th. 2016. Donald Trump ascends to the presidency in a shockwave that circled the globe. The entire entrenched political machine, the data analysts, the talking heads, the media darlings, the academic elite, and every single person who claimed to be an expert was proven completely and utterly wrong. And the only people who had their eyes open, the ones who saw the shift on the horizon, were the very people nobody thought were worth listening to. It was the coal miners, covered in dust in West Virginia, the assembly line workers in Michigan, the corn farmers in Iowa, the forgotten demographic, the ones who had been sowing seeds for decades only to watch strangers loot their harvest, season after season. These were the citizens labeled as deplorables, called irredeemable, mocked as bitter people clinging to guns and religion, the outcasts of the modern era. The ones who were condescendingly told their culture was a relic of the past and that they should just learn to write computer code if they wanted to eat. These people were the modern-day equivalent of Gideon's 300 men. They weren't chosen because they were morally superior, nor because they were spiritually pure, but because they had reached a breaking point of desperation that allowed them to put their faith in an outsider willing to take a sledgehammer to the status quo. And that is exactly what Trump did. He tore the altars down to the ground. He smashed the altar of political correctness. The altar of media manipulation, the altar of trusting the experts, the altar of endless foreign wars, the altar of accepting our decline, the altar of policing speech, the altar of tradition, and the altar of trusting the process. Trump took a massive sledgehammer and swung it wildly at the pillars of the establishment. And the result was absolute chaos. Half the nation cheered in liberation, while the other half suffered a complete psychological breakdown. You see, when you destroy an altar, you don't just anger the priests who serve it. You deeply offend every single person who has relied on that structure for their sense of self, their safety, and their understanding of how reality functions. You are literally fracturing their perception of reality. And history shows that people will resort to murder to keep their illusion of reality intact, even if that reality is slowly poisoning them. Now, let's connect the spiritual dots to our current year of 2026. If that presidency served as a wrecking ball for the altars of the white working class, we must ask, what are the idols that need to be pulverized for Black America? Because rest assured, we have them, and ours are more ancient, more entrenched, and more heavily guarded. We are talking about the altar of seeking white validation, the altar of playing respectable politics, the altar of begging for incremental crumbs of progress. The altar of wait your turn, the altar of defending not all white people, the altar that says it's about class, not race, and the deceptive altar that claims a degree is the only escape route. The altar of pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you know full well your boots were stolen and the leather straps were severed long ago. These are the sacred monuments we defend with our lives even as they actively participate in our destruction. These are the psychological idols we inherited from our fathers, who got them from their fathers' men who built these mental prisons under extreme duress. They built them under the reign of terror in conditions where constructing an altar to survival at all costs was the only strategy to ensure they woke up the next morning. But here is the trap. An altar built for survival transforms into a generational curse if you fail to demolish it once the immediate danger has shifted. And that's the trick. The threat hasn't vanished. The enemy simply updated their playbook. The land of Midian doesn't require whips and iron chains in 2026. Modern Midian utilizes predatory debt-biased algorithms, restrictive zoning laws, and prison labor quotas. Midian operates through gentrification, crushing student loans, insurmountable medical bills, and the credit score system. The swarms of Midian wear tailored suits and carry briefcases now, not broadswords, but the result is identical. The harvest is still being looted from your barns, and we are still hiding in the winepress, beating out our grain in fear. We are still defending the very structures that keep us trapped in that hole. But look at what the text hides in plain sight. In Judges chapter 7, verse 16, Gideon splits his 300 men into 3 units. He equips them with trumpets, empty clay jars, and burning torches. Look at that arsenal. No swords, no spears, no shields to protect their bodies, just trumpets, fragile pottery, and fire. Instruments of praise, vessels of brokenness and illumination. That is the whole plan. That is the divine strategy. And Gideon gives them the command, keep your eyes on me and do exactly as I do. When I reach the perimeter of the enemy camp, whatever action I take, you mirror it instantly. When the moment of truth arrives and the sound of my horn cuts through the silence, along with every soldier standing by my side, that is your signal. You are to unleash the trumpets from every corner of the camp, surrounding them completely, and roar with a unified battle cry, for the Lord and for Gideon. But hold on a second. Pause right there. Notice the phrasing, for the Lord and for Gideon. It isn't strictly for the Most High anymore. Gideon has attached his own name to the divine mission, fusing his identity with God's will. By inserting the deliverer's name into the war cry, a dangerous precedent is set. It creates a slippery slope toward idolatry, blurring the lines between the creator who gives the victory and the vessel used to achieve it. It opens the door for the people to revere the man Gideon far more than they reverence the God of Israel. And if you look at the historical record, that is precisely the tragedy that unfolds. Once the dust settles and the victory is secured, the people of Israel immediately turn to Gideon with a political proposition. They beg him to rule over them, not just for a term, but to establish a hereditary monarchy for him and his sons. They are crying out for a dynasty. The people are desperate for a strong man. They want to institutionalize the deliverer, turning a moment of liberation into a permanent system of government. Now Gideon plays the part of the humble servant. He verbally refuses the crown, but his lifestyle screams acceptance. He might decline the title of king, but he certainly adopts the trappings of royalty. He accumulates 70 wives, fashions a golden ephod for worship, and names his son Abimelech, which literally translates to, "My father is king." So the dynasty manifests regardless of his public denial. It happens unofficially. It bypasses the legal framework, operating not by decree but by influence and implication. In many ways, a functional dynasty is far more insidious than a legal one. A legal monarchy has rules, protocols, and clear targets that can be challenged, dismantled, or overthrown by the people. But a functional dynasty operates in the gray areas, moving in the shadows. It becomes the unspoken power dynamic. The hierarchy everyone understands. But no one names the arrangement where we pretend he isn't the king. Yet everyone bows to his will. And looking at the scriptures, that is exactly the chaotic vacuum that consumed the nation after Gideon passed away. His son, Abimelech, decided to rip the veil off. He attempted to convert that shadow authority into an official throne, and the cost of that ambition was the brutal execution of 69 of his own brothers. Now bring that lens to the present day, because the prophetic parallel with Donald Trump is impossible to ignore. This isn't just a man running a campaign, it is a movement. He didn't just run once. He is back in the arena again. Here we are in 2026. The man is pushing 80 years old. He has faced 91 criminal indictments spanning 4 different jurisdictions and has the distinction of being impeached twice. He has been deplatformed from the digital town square, investigated by every agency, audited, sued into oblivion, mocked by the media, and declared politically deceased more times than we can quantify. And despite every single one of those attacks, his base has not flinched. If anything, their volume has increased. They are far more vocal and energized now than they ever were back in 2016. The rallies have swelled into massive pilgrimages. The branding and merchandise cover the landscape. Their conviction is not tentative. It is absolute and unshakable. They genuinely believe he is divinely anointed for this hour. In their eyes, he is not just a candidate. He is the solitary figure capable of saving the republic from destruction. The belief system is that if he does not reclaim power, the entire nation is doomed. That is not standard political loyalty or civic duty. That is religious devotion. It is the modern manifestation of shouting for the Lord and for Gideon. This is the inevitable result when the concept of deliverance mutates into a demand for a dynasty. It happens when the man eclipses the message, when the flawed human vessel is elevated to the status of a golden idol. And for the Black community, we need to be paying very close attention to this dynamic. I am not saying this to tell you to vote for Trump or to join the resistance against him. I am telling you this because we must study the pattern of idolatry and political messiahs. We need to understand the psychology of a people so starved for salvation that they begin to worship the deliverer rather than the God who orchestrated the deliverance. We need to recognize the danger in the atmosphere when the crowd starts chanting for the Lord and for Gideon in the same breath. Because inevitably, as time marches on, the "for the Lord" portion of the chant becomes a whisper, while the "for Gideon" part turns into a deafening roar until eventually God is forgotten and you are only shouting for the man. And when that man eventually dies, fails, or reveals his flaws, as all men do, you are left spiritually bankrupt because you constructed your entire faith on a human foundation. Men will always succumb to mortality. Men will fail you. Men will disappoint you every time. But the Most High never fails. If you cannot discern the difference between the vessel and the source, you will waste your entire existence waiting for the next Gideon to appear, rather than rising up to become one of the 300 warriors. But let's look at the archives, because history tells another side of this story. Let us go back to 1874 to the catastrophic collapse of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company. This institution was chartered by Congress in 1865 with a specific mandate to assist newly emancipated Black people in saving their wages, building generational wealth, and making the difficult transition from chattel slavery to economic sovereignty. By the time 1874 rolled around, this bank had expanded to branches in 37 different cities, holding the hard-earned deposits of over 70,000 Black families. Think about that, 70,000 families. These were men and women who had legally owned nothing, not even their own bodies, who suddenly possessed bank accounts. They were disciplined. They were saving for the future. They were strategizing. They were thinking about their children's children. They were building a foundation. And then, without warning, the bank collapsed. And let's be clear, it did not fail because Black people couldn't manage money. It wasn't due to a lack of financial literacy in the community. It collapsed because the white board of directors gambled with those deposits, engaging in speculative, high-risk investments that had nothing to do with the depositors' interests. When those reckless gambles imploded, the bank went under, dragging the dreams of a generation down with it. And the United States government, the very entity that chartered the bank and promised protection, refused to reimburse a single dime. 70,000 Black families were wiped out financially in the blink of an eye. Their entire life savings evaporated into thin air, and the psychological trauma inflicted by that betrayal is impossible to calculate. An entire generation was taught a brutal lesson. Do not trust the banks, do not trust the systems, and do not save your money, because accumulation just signals to the predator that you have something worth taking. They learned that accumulation puts a target on your back. To be visible is to be vulnerable. That is the spirit of Midian. That is the swarm of locusts coming to devour. This is distinct from slavery. This is strategic theft executed precisely at the moment of harvest. The enemy lets you plant the seeds. They let you toil in the sun. They let you build the structure. And then right at that critical moment when you are about to cross over from mere survival into stability and prosperity, they strike the match and burn it all to the ground. They hit you with foreclosure. They draw red lines around your neighborhoods. They gentrify your legacy out of existence. They criminalize your existence. They pass laws making it illegal for you to rebuild what they destroyed. And if by some miracle of resilience the people manage to rebuild from the ashes, they do it all over again. Look at Tulsa. Look at Rosewood, Wilmington, Elaine, Ocoee, Springfield, East St. Louis. The list goes on and on. There is always a list, and that scroll is filled with blood and ash. Every single name on that list represents a thriving Black community that built an economy that prospered, that accumulated wealth, and was subsequently annihilated by white violence that was sanctioned and backed by white law. It involves the corrupt law enforcement officers, the executives sitting in white-owned insurance firms, and the government officials who turned a blind eye. These are the people who either actively struck the match to burn our communities down or stood by with their arms folded, refusing to bring the arsonist to justice. This is the classic Midianite blueprint, and make no mistake, it is fully operational today. The only thing that has changed is the camouflage. The tactics have evolved, but the spirit remains exactly the same. It manifests as the housing market collapse of 2008. A calculated disaster that evaporated 53% of Black generational wealth in a mere 5-year span. Let that sink in, 53%. We aren't talking about a dip in white portfolios. We are talking about the systematic erasure of Black abundance. They deployed weapons of mass financial destruction. Toxic subprime mortgages, predatory lending schemes exploding, balloon payments, and adjustable rates designed to fail. Every single one of these traps was set specifically and disproportionately for black borrowers. The dehumanization was written in black and white. Internal emails from major institutions like Wells Fargo referred to human beings as mud people. Mud people. That isn't hearsay. That is a fact revealed in court documents and federal lawsuits. It is part of the permanent record of how they view us. They aimed their sights at the pillars of our community. Black churches, historic black neighborhoods, and hard-working black families who were simply following the American rulebook. They were trying to buy a home, build a legacy, and pass wealth to their children only to be hunted down. When the house of cards inevitably fell and the banks were staring into the abyss, the government rushed in with a golden parachute worth $700 billion. Yet for the families watching their furniture be put out on the curb, the grandmothers losing their retirement nest eggs, and the parents losing their hard-earned down payments, there was absolutely no rescue. They received zero. There were no reparations checks, no restitution for the fraud, and certainly no apologies. Instead, we got condescending lectures about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and the importance of personal responsibility and financial literacy. They spoke as if reading a spreadsheet could protect you from a sniper, as if knowing the math could save you from a predatory system explicitly architected to strip you bare. This is precisely why the biblical account of Gideon is so critical for us right now. Gideon was not engaged in traditional warfare against an enemy lined up on an open battlefield. He was up against a parasitic force that waited for the harvest season. This enemy watched you plow the field, plant the seeds, and water the ground, waiting until the crop was ready before swooping in to steal the fruit of your labor. This was not an enemy that needed to put you in physical iron chains. They enslaved you through inescapable cycles of debt, poverty, and loss. For 7 long years, the people suffered under this oppression. 7 years of planting only to lose it all. 7 years of working yourself to the bone only to starve. 7 years of retreating into caves and hiding in wine presses just to keep a handful of grain. In that dark hour, God did not call upon a mighty warrior or a confident general. He raised up a man who was trembling with fear, just as broken as the rest of them, with no master plan and no standing army to command. This was a man who questioned his own worthiness, who looked in the mirror and saw a nobody. But God was not looking for swagger or self-assurance. The Almighty chose him for one specific trait: his willingness to obey when it didn't make sense. Once Gideon stepped out in obedience and tore down the idol's altar under the cover of darkness, when he finally stopped protecting the very culture that was cursing his people, God downloaded a strategy so illogical to the human mind that its success could only be attributed to divine intervention. 300 men, clay jars, ram's horn trumpets, flaming torches, no swords, no shields, no conventional weapons. Just a combination of sudden light, deafening sound, and radical faith causing the Midianite army to implode. This right here is the divine blueprint for black liberation in 2026. It is not about matching their violence or seeking petty revenge. We cannot win by using the enemy's weapons. We win through exposure, through the blinding light of truth, and by shattering the clay shells we have been hiding inside to reveal the fire burning within us. We must surround the system with so many undeniable points of illumination that it induces panic. We need them to turn on each other, exposing their own deep-seated corruption, their hypocrisy, and the fact that their power structure is fundamentally unsustainable. And here is the reason why this strategy is guaranteed to work. This is the secret that the modern Midianites are desperate to keep hidden from you. Their system is already in the process of self-destruction. The beast is already eating its own tail. Look around you. The empire is crumbling at the foundations. The dominance of the dollar is under siege globally. The national debt has spiraled beyond control, and the physical infrastructure is rotting away. The public trust has evaporated. Their institutional legitimacy is dissolving before our eyes. Our job is not to push it over. Our job is simply to shine. All we must do is smash the jars. We need to unveil what we have been cultivating in the shadows, the structures we built, in the wine presses and hidden corners of society, while the powers that be were too distracted looting the public treasury to pay attention to us. We have been quietly establishing independent homeschool cooperatives to educate our own minds. We have been securing land trusts, capitalizing Black-owned credit unions, and growing parallel food systems. We are talking about alternative currencies, self-sustaining, off-grid communities, mutual aid networks that actually help skill-sharing economies and projects, preserving our true oral history. We have been planting these seeds in the dark away from their prying eyes, and now the harvest season is finally upon us. When those jars shatter and when the 300 chosen ones stand up in unison across this nation and throughout the diaspora, raising torches that have been smoldering in silence for 400 years, the modern Midian will go into absolute shock. They will look at 300 illuminated souls, and in their terror they will perceive an army of 300,000. They will see the blinding light of truth and realize their game of deception is finished. That is the moment they will turn their swords against one another. The system is programmed to cannibalize its own existence. The empire will devour its own limbs. And the beauty of it is we will not have to fire a single physical shot. Our only assignment is to shine. But we must be honest, before the shining comes the breaking. And the breaking is painful because the jar feels like home. It feels familiar. The jar represents safety. It is the protective shell that has kept the fire contained so it wouldn't consume us or draw unwanted attention. That jar is every compromise we have ever made. It is every time we code switch to make them comfortable. It is every forced smile in the face of a microaggression, every submissive, "Yes, sir," every bit of rage we swallowed, and every performance of non-threatening blackness. It is the strategy of assimilation and the silence we kept to survive. The jar is the construct we built just to make it through the day alive. But now the Most High is speaking clearly. I did not bring you through the fire and flood just to survive. I brought you this far to shine, and you cannot do both simultaneously. You cannot contain the glory and release the glory at the same time. You have to break the container. Let it shatter into a million pieces. Let the shards fall where they may, and let the fire roar. Just watch what happens when the enemy sees 300 points of uncompromising, unapologetic, undiluted spiritual fire erupting in the middle of their camp at the stroke of midnight. That is the prophetic timeline we are living in right now. That is the divine command resting on our shoulders. This is the ultimate choice, staring us in the face. Break the shell or stay hidden in the dark. Shine for the world or merely survive in the shadows. Join the 300 or remain cowering in the winepress. And if you make the bold choice to break, if you decide to let your light shine, you must understand the cost. You are choosing a season of isolation before you reach the season of vindication. You are actively choosing a path where rejection comes long before recognition. You are signing your name to a destiny where you will be labeled reckless, branded a radical, called a divisive extremist, and considered a threat to public safety long before anyone dares to call you courageous. Look at Gideon. The mob calling for his head wasn't an invading army from across the border. It was his neighbors. These were his own people, the very community he grew up in. These were the men who should have been thanking him on their knees for having the audacity to smash the very altar that was poisoning their bloodline and cursing their children. But appreciation is a luxury that comes much later. In the heat of the moment, there was only pure, unadulterated fury. There were death threats. There was violence. First came the screaming demands for his public execution. You have to understand, when you tear down a demonic altar, you aren't just knocking over a physical structure. You are declaring war on the identity of every single person who built their life and their sense of self around that structure. You are indicting every father who taught his son to bow at that shrine. You are challenging a community that has been defending their dysfunction with the same passion they should have used to defend the laws of God. And make no mistake, they will hate you with a perfect hatred until their false god Baal fails to answer by fire, until the heavy yoke of the curse finally lifts, and until the true harvest begins to break through the ground. Only at that breaking point will they either humble themselves and repent like Joash, or they will double down and try to reconstruct the altar under a new brand name, just like the nation did the moment Gideon was in the grave. We need to talk about the text because your Bible footnote is likely misleading you. Most modern translations of Judges chapter 8 verse 27 state that Gideon made an ephod and all Israel prostituted themselves to it. That is technically accurate, but what the footnote fails to explain is the deep significance of what an ephod actually was in that culture. This wasn't some random idol. An ephod was the supreme priestly garment, the vestment worn by the high priest, specifically when entering the Holy of Holies to receive counsel from the Almighty. Go back to Exodus chapter 28. It describes a masterpiece woven of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet threads, crafted with fine linen and set with precious jewels. It carried stones engraved with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was consecrated. It was sanctified. It was the physical touchpoint of the divine presence. This garment symbolized the bridge of intercession between a sinful people and a holy God. So, when Gideon crafts this object and puts it on display in his hometown, do not get it twisted. He is not building a statue to Baal. He is creating an unauthorized copy of something God ordained. He is counterfeiting the sacred. And family, that is the most seductive and lethal form of idolatry in existence. It is not the blatant, open rejection of God. It is the subtle, arrogant replacement of God's established order with a man-made version of that order. It is the spirit that says, we don't need the tabernacle at Shiloh. We don't need the Levitical priesthood. We don't need the ancient system God set in stone. We can manufacture our own access. We can do it our way. We can worship God on our own terms, and the scripture says all Israel played the harlot with it. Not because it looked plainly evil, but because it looked so incredibly holy. It had the aesthetic of legitimacy. It looked like worship, but it was located in a place God never sanctioned. It ignored the protocol God commanded. It was Gideon's great innovation, his clever solution to a spiritual problem. It was Gideon's attempt to franchise access to God, bypassing the mediator, bypassing the tabernacle, and bypassing the structure. And that solution became a trap that snapped the neck of the nation. The people began to worship the vehicle of revelation rather than the revealer. They fell in love with the ephod and forgot the God it was supposed to represent. They stopped making the pilgrimage to the tabernacle. They flocked to Gideon's city instead. They stopped consulting the priests and started looking to a celebrity leader and his golden vest. Within a single generation, the entire moral system collapsed. This is the flashing red warning light for every movement, every revolution, and every reformation we see today. Every single time a leader tears down a demonic altar and immediately tries to build a new one without the specific blueprint of heaven, it becomes a snare. Look at our history. The civil rights movement dismantled the legal framework of Jim Crow only to unintentionally lay the foundation for the nonprofit industrial complex that profits off our struggle. The Black Power movement smashed the idol of forced integration, but replaced it with cultural aesthetics, dashikis, and catchy slogans, all while lacking the hard economic infrastructure to sustain the people. Black Lives Matter shattered the silence surrounding police brutality, yet it morphed into a corporate brand that raised $90 million to buy mansions, while the grassroots activists on the front lines went to prison or died. Broke. Every generation manages to destroy one altar only to turn around and construct a new one because we simply do not possess the discipline to live in the tension. We don't know how to wait in the void for God to establish His divine order. We are too impatient, too traumatized by the past, and too desperate for instant solutions. So we innovate, we create, we build out of anxiety. And the very thing we build in our flesh becomes the next stronghold that God has to raise up our children to tear down. The only way to break this generational cycle is to stop building altars the moment God tears the old one down. You must resist the urge to fill the empty space. Stop rushing to erect organizations before God has handed you the architectural blueprints. Stop letting your craving for certainty overrule the command for total obedience. Gideon should have left that space barren after he pulverized Baal's altar. He should have let the community sit in the awkward, uncomfortable silence of having no local shrine in their backyard. He should have forced them to go to the tabernacle, to the specific place God chose, to the priests God ordained, to the system God actually established. But he failed the test. He offered them a spiritual shortcut, and that shortcut morphed into a death trap. The snare became an abomination, the abomination became a bloodbath, and the bloodbath ushered in the next wave of oppression. That is the high price of refusing to wait in the wilderness. That is the price of begging for a human king when the Most High said, "I am your king." That is the cost of demanding a strong man to save us when God said he is our strength. It is the cost of smelting golden calves just because Moses has been up on the mountain a little too long for our liking. That is the terrible cost of every compromise we make when the silence of heaven feels deafening, when the promises feel like a mirage, when the enemy is breathing down our necks and we just need something, anything, to make the chaos make sense. So instead of waiting, we build. The empires we construct with our own hands today inevitably become the chains that shackle our children tomorrow. This vicious loop spins endlessly until a soul arrives who is sufficiently shattered, desperate, and submissive to God to smash the shrine under the cover of darkness, and then possesses the fortitude not to erect a replacement when the sun rises. We are standing at that precise precipice right now. This is the ultimate examination. The high places are being dismantled before our eyes. Trump acted as a wrecking ball for political norms. The global pandemic leveled our illusion of safety. The televised martyrdom of George Floyd tore down the veil of post-racial ignorance. The institutions we once held as sacred are revealed to be naked and corrupt. The heavy hitters we idolized are shown to be frauds. The infrastructure of our society is buckling under its own weight. And in that terrifying vacuum, that empty silence, humanity is frantically trying to cobble together a substitute. We see a mad rush for fresh movements, charismatic figureheads, novel philosophies, and quick-fix remedies to patch the holes in the hull. But let me tell you, every single one of those replacements is a trap waiting to snap shut. We will be caught unless we master the art of holy patience. We must learn to sit in the agonizing discomfort of an empty pedestal. We have to learn how to process our harvest in the shadows, threshing wheat on the high ground, even while our knees are knocking together in pure terror. It requires surrendering our calendar to the Almighty's schedule rather than forcing our own agenda. Here is the spiritual download. The 300 men didn't conquer because they were elite warriors. They triumphed solely because they followed instructions. Gideon didn't secure victory through self-confidence. He won because he took the next step even while trembling in his boots. And listen closely. Black America will not ascend because we finally got the logistics right, or the funding secured, or the speech polished, or the political game mastered. We will ascend only when the Creator commands us to shatter the clay pitcher and we actually smash it without hesitation. Even if the command defies all logic, even if it leaves us wide open to attack, even if our own community wants to stone us for rocking the boat, we must break it. We have to let the hidden fire blaze forth. We have to stand on the conviction that 300 flickering torches are sufficient to send a swarm of millions into a chaotic stampede. That is the definition of biblical faith. That is the caliber of belief that shifts tectonic plates, splits the ocean floor levels, fortifications, and rescues a people from a bondage so complete, so woven into the DNA of the nation that nothing short of divine intervention could ever sever the chains. Now, if Donald Trump truly functions as a modern-day Gideon, then his biography serves as a flashing red warning light for us. Yes, his disruptive presence pulled the covers off the corrupt system. However, his golden ephod, whatever symbolic trophy that becomes, will inevitably trap the very masses who venerate the man more than the sovereign Lord who utilized him as a tool. Our assignment is to break that historical loop, not perpetuate it. We are called to extract the lesson from the wreckage. We must allow Providence to elevate our Gideon, that imperfect, shaking, improbable rescuer, and then fight the desperate compulsion to crown them royalty. We must applaud the liberation while refusing to deify the liberator. We respect the blood sacrifice without constructing a temple to the one who bled. We memorialize the win without resurrecting the idol that caused the war. That is true spiritual sagacity. That is what grown-up faith looks like. It is the critical distinction between a people who have been rescued and a people who are truly emancipated. Rescue extracts you from the foundry of Egypt. Freedom ensures you never return to the brickyards. And true liberty demands that you never, ever, ever allow a mortal human being to occupy the throne of your heart again. There is a specific archival image that completely shifted my paradigm. It was captured in 1916, documenting a public lynching in the state of Georgia. It is one of those grotesque postcards that white citizens used to mail to their kinfolk with casual inscriptions like, "Wish you were here," as if they were on vacation. In the frame, yes, there is a black body suspended from a branch. But that is not the element that stopped my heart. It is the audience that chills the blood. You see hundreds of pale faces, gentlemen in three-piece suits, ladies in their finest Sunday church attire, toddlers perched on their daddy's shoulders for a clearer vantage point. And the most chilling part, they are beaming. Every last one of them is grinning like they are at a 4th of July barbecue, as if the mangled human swinging overhead is merely a sideshow attraction. Down in the corner, barely in frame, a man clutches a snippet of the hemp rope, a keepsake to cherish the memory, a souvenir of slaughter. You need to understand that the photograph itself depicts the altar. It is not the oak tree, it is not the fiber noose, and it is certainly not the victim. The altar is the mob. The altar is the collective, unspoken social contract that declares this atrocity as standard operating procedure, that this is what justice looks like, that this is the natural order of the universe. The altar is the catechism of those children being silently instructed that black anatomy is a public spectacle. They are learning that the extinction of black life is permissible, and that the value of black humanity is always up for negotiation. Here is the nightmare fuel. The vast majority of those spectators sat in pews the very next morning. They belted out hymns. They partook of the bread and wine. They petitioned heaven for favor. It never once crossed their minds that they were bowing the knee to Baal. They were fully convinced the blood-stained shrine in the town square was righteous. They believed the deity they petitioned was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that is the prestige. That is the grand illusion. That is how an entire civilization can operate under a hex while labeling it a holy covenant. The generation of Gideon had no idea they were Baal worshippers. They thought they were simply hedging their bets. They viewed it as necessary pragmatism for the times. The mindset was that Yahweh took care of the afterlife and ethics, while Baal controlled the weather and the economy. It was a division of labor. It was a separation of church and state, the sacred and the secular, Sunday piety versus Monday payroll. They never realized that the crushing weight of Midian was the direct consequence of that bifurcation. You cannot hold allegiance to two sovereigns. Syncretism, the mixing of the holy with the profane, is straight idolatry. The deliverer who snatched you from the jaws of Pharaoh will permit the enemy to plunder your granaries until you recall exactly who he is. Not the version of him that fits your lifestyle, not the convenient caricature, but the I am as he actually exists, the creator who refuses to split his glory, the God who burns with holy jealousy, the sovereign who will shatter your legs to keep you from walking after other lovers before he lets you worship a counterfeit. He will intervene even if your idol looks like prudence, sounds like geopolitical strategy, and feels like necessary survival. The arithmetic is undeniably clear. Count the 400 years from 1619 to 2019. Look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Then the Creator spoke directly to Abraham, laying out a divine blueprint that would span centuries. He said, "You need to know this for a fact. With absolute certainty, your offspring, your bloodline, will be strangers in a strange land. They will dwell in a country that does not belong to them. They will be forced into servitude, and they will be crushed under the weight of affliction for 400 years. Now understand what we are reading here. This is not some poetic metaphor or a figure of speech to make a point. This is hard-coded prophecy. This is the Most High giving Abraham a terrifying preview of the trauma awaiting his descendants. 4 centuries of systemic oppression, 400 years of grinding struggle. But then look at verse 14, because the story does not end in chains. God flips the script. He says, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve." There is a divine court case pending against the oppressor. And after that judgment falls, after the gavel strikes, they shall come out. They are going to walk out of that house of bondage with great possessions. Do not miss that detail. Judgment hits the nation that enslaved them, and the result is freedom coupled with generational wealth. They didn't leave empty-handed, they didn't leave broke, and they didn't leave so traumatized that they couldn't function. They left heavy with assets. This is the biblical basis for reparations long before the modern world ever coined the term. Restitution was baked into the prophetic cake from day one. But here is the catch: Egypt did not want to cut that check. The system was never going to voluntarily let Israel go. Pharaoh hardened his heart 10 separate times because giving up his free labor force would bankrupt his empire. So God sent 10 plagues. This wasn't just random acts of nature. This was strategic warfare. Water turning to blood, frogs overrunning the palace, clouds of gnats and flies, livestock dropping dead, festering boils, catastrophic hail swarms of locusts, and total darkness. Then came the final blow, the death of the firstborn. You have to understand, each one of these plagues was a calculated sniper shot at an Egyptian deity. The Nile River wasn't just water to them, it was the god Hapi. When it turned to blood, God was saying, "Your provider is dead." Pharaoh walked around thinking he was a god in human flesh. The sun was worshipped as Ra. The cattle were considered sacred symbols of fertility and power. With every single plague, the Most High was systematically dismantling the entire pantheon of Egypt's spiritual system. He was proving that the idols they bowed to were powerless, that the altars they built were actually portals for curses, and that their magic was counterfeit. He was showing them that the very system they trusted to maintain their power was nothing but dust in the wind. And when Pharaoh finally broke, when the resistance shattered and he let Israel go, when the death angel moved silently over the land, passing over every doorpost marked with blood, when Moses raised his staff and the Red Sea tore open, when the entire Egyptian military machine drowned while trying to recapture the people they should have liberated, Israel didn't just run for their lives. They left carrying gold, silver, precious jewelry, and fine clothing. Look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36. It spells it out clearly. The scriptures say the people of Israel did exactly what Moses instructed. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver, articles of gold, and for clothing, and the Lord gave the people supernatural favor in the sight of their oppressors, to the point where the Egyptians let them have whatever they asked for. And the text concludes with this powerful line, "Thus they plundered the Egyptians." Plundered. That is the specific word used. They didn't borrow it with a promise to pay it back. They didn't beg for charity. They plundered the empire. They repossessed what had been stolen from them during 400 years of unpaid, backbreaking labor. They took back the equity they had built. They took back the wealth they had generated for another man's kingdom. They collected what was owed with interest. And realize, this God orchestrated the heist. God gave them the favor. God made the Egyptians willing to hand over the keys to the vault. This establishes a universal spiritual law. When divine judgment falls on a nation that has built its economy on slavery, Restitution is not a suggestion. It is not optional. It is inevitable. This principle is woven into the very fabric of how the Creator moves through human history. Oppression always carries an expiration date, and when that date arrives on God's calendar, the wealth transfers. It doesn't happen because the oppressed group rioted effectively, or because they hired the best lobbyists, or even because they voted harder. It happens because God looked at the timeline and said, "Enough." And when the Almighty says enough, superpowers crumble, economies collapse, and wealth is redistributed from the wicked to the righteous. The people who were afflicted walk out of the rubble with great possessions. Now let us overlay this template onto our reality. Fast forward from the ancient world to the timeline of 1619 to 2019. That is exactly 400 years. The first recorded ship carrying enslaved Africans, the White Lion, arrived at Point Comfort in Virginia near Jamestown in late August of 1619. Roughly 20 enslaved ancestors were traded for supplies by English privateers. Now you will have scholars and historians arguing semantics. They will say, well, technically they were indentured servants, not chattel slaves. Or they will argue that slavery as a codified legal institution didn't fully solidify until the 1660s. But spiritual mathematics does not care about your legal loopholes or academic definitions. The prophetic clock started ticking the moment they touched that soil in 1619. And exactly 400 years later, in 2019, something massively shifted in the spiritual atmosphere. If you were paying attention, you felt it. The energy changed. The veil covering the eyes of the world began to thin. The lies that held the structure together became impossible to maintain. The matrix started glitching. Suddenly, the algorithms that were designed to suppress truth started exposing what they were supposed to hide. Videos of brutality started going viral globally. The murders that used to happen in the dark were being recorded in high definition. The wall of silence started to crack wide open. And then, right on the heels of that 400-year mark, the year 2020 hit us. A global pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the uprisings in every major city, the racial reckonings, and major corporations scrambling to save face. We watched statues of colonizers being toppled, money suddenly pouring into diversity, equity, and inclusion budgets, and conversations about systemic racism that had been suppressed for decades becoming unavoidable at the dinner table. The debate around reparations shifted from being a fringe topic laughed at by politicians to a mainstream policy discussion. Consider H.R. 40, the bill to study reparations. It was introduced way back in 1989 and gathered dust for decades. Finally, in 2021, it got a hearing. 32 years of being ignored, and suddenly it's on the table. Why now? Why did the urgency ramp up? Because the 400 years are up. Because God's timeline does not operate on American comfort or political convenience. It runs on prophetic precision. And when that cosmic clock strikes midnight, everything changes. But we have to be honest with ourselves. This is also where the situation gets incredibly dangerous. The wealth transfer has technically begun, the mechanism is in motion, but as a people, we are not mentally prepared to receive it. It is the exact same problem ancient Israel faced. They weren't ready for the promised land. They got all the way to the border, sent 12 spies to scout the territory, and 10 of them came back trembling in fear. They said the cities are fortified with walls up to heaven, and the people are giants. And then they said the most damaging thing possible, recorded in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Catch that phrase, like grasshoppers in our own sight. They didn't report that the giants called them insects. They said they looked in the mirror and saw insects. The centuries of oppression had gotten inside their minds. It had warped their self-image. It had damaged their identity to the core. The trauma had convinced them that they were small, insignificant, and powerless, and because they believed that lie, they could not unlock the promise. As a result, they wandered in circles in the wilderness for 40 years. An entire generation had to die off in the desert before their children could enter the land. It wasn't because God changed his mind about the promise. It was because they couldn't change their minds about themselves. Here we are in 2026, and Black America is standing at that exact same edge. The promised land is visible on the horizon. The wealth transfer is imminent. The old systems are collapsing in real time. The empire is cannibalizing itself under the weight of its own corruption. The judgment is falling just as predicted. But the question remains, do we see ourselves as kings and queens ready to inherit, or do we still see grasshoppers? The prophecy is fulfilled, but the mindset must be renewed. We remain paralyzed by terror because deep within our psyche we still view ourselves as grasshoppers. We look in the mirror and see victims rather than victors. We are suffering from spiritual Stockholm syndrome, believing we are dependent on the very systems designed to keep us oppressed. As long as we hold on to that slave mentality, we will wander in the wilderness. We might secure the bag, but we will lose the legacy. We will attain high-ranking positions only to compromise our integrity to keep them. We will build massive platforms, but instead of using them for truth, we will just perform like minstrels for the algorithm. We will get within proximity of the throne and delude ourselves into thinking we possess the power. And if we do not wake up, the next generation will be forced to fight these same giants on this same mountain because we refuse to smash the altars today. The cycle does not end until we shatter the clay jars. It does not end until we undergo a radical paradigm shift and start seeing ourselves through the lens of the Creator. We are not insects to be crushed. We are not merely victims or survivors. We are kingdom deliverers, royal priests, sovereign kings, and spiritual warriors. We are the head and not the tail, escalating above only and never beneath the lenders to nations, and not the borrowers from banks. We are the Josephs and the Daniels, the people the nations will run to for answers when their secular systems collapse and their markets crash. That is the mandate of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 13. That is the blessing side of the covenant. But we have been camping out in verses 15 through 68 for so many generations that we have developed amnesia about verse 13. We have been so institutionalized by the curse that the blessing looks like a fantasy to us. We have been hiding in the winepress, thrashing wheat in fear for so long that taking the hilltop feels like a suicide mission. This is exactly why the Most High is wrecking our idols. He is not doing it to punish us. He is doing it to prepare us. You cannot drag a grasshopper complex into a giant slaying season. You cannot carry a victim mentality into a season of generational wealth building. You cannot utilize survival tactics in a season of dominion and authority. The old wineskins will burst. The clay jars must be shattered to release the light. The demonic altars must be leveled. These false gods of culture must be exposed as the powerless frauds they truly are. And then when there is nowhere left to hide, no one left to blame, and no lies left to defend, God can finally forge you into the battle axe He intended you to be before the foundations of the earth. Look at the text. Gideon became a mighty man of valor the exact moment he stopped debating with God. The moment he tore down his father's altar, the moment he moved in obedience despite his trembling knees, everything changed. The angel did not call him a warrior because he was acting like one. The angel called him a mighty warrior because God was about to transform him into one. That is the operation of God. He addresses you by what you are becoming, not by your current mess. He speaks to your destiny, never your history. If you can summon the courage to obey, to wreck the high places and break your jars, you will realize that the identity you were fiercely defending was the only blockade standing between you and your divine purpose. You have to connect the prophetic dots here. The Trump presidency ripped the mask off the system. The pandemic exposed the fragility of the system. George Floyd revealed the injustice of the system. January 6th showed the instability of the system. The election of 2024 and everything leading into 2026 has exposed the rot in the system. Every major shaking in the last decade has hit like one of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Yahweh is sniping every deity in the American pantheon, taking them out one by one. He is toppling the god of media credibility, the god of medical authority, the god of law enforcement legitimacy, the god of democratic stability, and the golden calf of economic invincibility. The dominoes are falling, the altars are turning to dust. The mirage is fading, and the masses are in a state of absolute panic. Because when you have tethered your entire identity to institutions you thought were eternal, and those institutions crumble, you experience a grief that feels like your soul is dying. But hear me clearly, it is not death, it is birth. However, to the baby, being born feels exactly like dying. The womb is the only universe you know. The pressure is crushing. The darkness is absolute. Suddenly, you are ejected into blinding light, cold air, and overwhelming noise. It is terrifying and completely disorienting. You are screaming in terror, unaware that this trauma is actually the best thing that ever happened to you. That is precisely where we stand right now. That is the transition of 2026. We are in the birth canal. Everyone is screaming because nobody preached that deliverance looks like disaster. We hallucinated that deliverance would be clean, triumphant, and comfortable. We thought we would wake up one morning, the chains would magically dissolve, the enemy would vanish, and we would waltz into the promised land with ticker tape parades and confetti. But that is a fairy tale. Real deliverance is violent. It is chaotic. It is divisive. It cleaves families in two. It fractures communities and splits churches. It forces a binary choice, the altar of Baal or the fire of God. There is no middle ground. You cannot be lukewarm when the millstone comes crashing down. You are either under it or you are out of the way. Those who are still trying to prop up the old altars are going to be crushed by the falling stone. This is the grim reality they skip in seminary. The book of Judges does not have a happy ending. After Gideon passes after the reign of terror of Abimelech, after Tola and Jair, the nation slides right back into the mud. Look at Judges chapter 10, verse 6. The children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals, the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. They completely abandoned the Lord and refused to serve him. That is 7 distinct pantheons of demons. They didn't just backslide to Baal. They diversified their idolatry. They were collecting false gods like they were trading cards. And God's response in verse 13 is the most terrifying thing in Scripture. Yet you have abandoned me and served other gods. Therefore I will save you no more. Read that again. I will save you no more. God issues a divorce decree, not permanently but functionally. He hands them over. He looks at them with a fire in his eyes and says, "You want those other gods so badly, go ahead. Let them save you when the hammer drops. I am officially done playing games." And that is the moment absolute panic sets in. The people start losing their minds. They scream, they cry out, they finally hit their knees in desperate repentance because they realize their safety net is gone. They didn't just talk about it. They cleaned house. They physically removed the foreign idols and rededicated themselves to serving the Lord. Look at verse 16. It says explicitly that they put away the strange gods from among them and served the Lord. They stopped the lip service and started the life service. And that is when everything shifted. The scripture says, "He became impatient over the misery of Israel." Think about that phrasing. His soul could no longer endure the suffering of his people. He became restless, agitated, and deeply moved by their wretched condition. Make no mistake, this wasn't indifference, and it certainly wasn't vindictiveness. It was impatience born of love. It was the urgent, overwhelming desire to step in and stop the pain. A divine compulsion that refused to sit still while his people hurt. It is exactly like a father watching his children suffer the brutal consequences of their own rebellious choices. He wants to jump in and fix it. His heart is breaking, but he knows deep down that if he intervenes too early before the lesson truly sinks in, they will never grow up. That is the unbearable tension of true love. That is the heartbreak of the divine. You are looking at a God who is simultaneously perfectly just and infinitely merciful, completely holy yet overflowing with compassion. He is the one who sternly declares, "I will not save you again," while his heart screams that he cannot bear to see you broken. He is the one who says, "I'm finished with you" in one breath, and then finds himself unable to watch you bleed in the next. But understand this clearly. There is a condition. There is always a prerequisite for the turnaround. Repentance without corresponding action is nothing more than emotional manipulation. Israel didn't just stand there and weep. They got to work. They put away the foreign gods. They didn't just offer a tearful apology. They dismantled the very things that offended God. They went out and tore down the altars they had built. They didn't just admit, "Yeah, we messed up." They fundamentally changed their behavior. They altered their lifestyle. They destroyed the evidence of their betrayal. And it was only then, after the idols were smashed, that God raised up Jephthah, the next judge, the next warrior, to lead them. Only then did God make his move. Why? Because God does not respond to your eloquent words or your perfect speeches. He responds to one thing and one thing only: obedience. He is not moved by your emotional outbursts. He is moved by your tangible actions. You can cry until you are dehydrated. You can pray until your voice gives out. You can fast until you are weak in the knees. You can perform every religious ritual in the book, but if you are still bowing down at the altar of compromise the moment you finish praying, if you are still defending that pet idol the second you break your fast, if you are still serving Baal after wiping your tears, God's answer remains exactly the same. Let Baal save you. I am checking out. And family, that is exactly where Black America stands right now in 2026. We have been crying out for deliverance, for freedom, for relief for over 400 years. We have been praying for justice to roll down like water. We have been fasting for a supernatural breakthrough in our communities. And God keeps replying with the same message: tear down the altars first. You have to tear down the altar of white supremacy that you have internalized and made your own. You have to smash the altar of colorism that divides us from within. You need to tear down the altar of misogyny that lies and says Black women are the mules of the earth, destined only to carry burdens and never to be cherished. Tear down the nasty altar of homophobia that convinces you it is righteous to reject your own flesh and blood children just because they don't fit into your narrow religious box. Tear down the altar of classism that tries to tell you that being bougie and articulate makes you better than the brother or sister still in the hood. Tear down the altar of educational elitism that claims a university degree makes your soul more valuable than the man or woman working with their hands in a trade. Tear down the altar of generational trauma that whispers you are cursed to repeat every single mistake your parents made. Tear down the altar of fear that lies to you, saying that playing small and staying quiet is the only way to be safe. Tear down the altar of scarcity that convinces you there isn't enough pie for everyone, so you have to compete with crush and betray your own people just to get a crumb. Tear down every single altar you built in moments of compromise, in survival mode, in desperation, in ignorance, and in fear. Level them to the ground. Tear them all down, clear the debris, and then watch what God does. Because here is the promise that holds true for 2026 and beyond. When the altars finally fall, when the false gods are exposed for the frauds, they are when the idols are pulverized, and the people serve the Lord, and only the Lord God becomes impatient over their misery. He reaches a point where he literally cannot stand it anymore. He moves with velocity. He raises up deliverers from unexpected places. He breaks the iron yokes off your neck. He initiates the transfer of wealth. He stands up to judge the nations. He plunders the empires that held you captive. He makes a highway in the middle of the wilderness where there was no path before. But hear me clearly. He will not do it while you are still hedging your bets. He will not move while you are still worshiping at Baal's altar during the week and calling it a business strategy. He will not intervene while you are still hiding, thrashing around in the winepress like Gideon, terrified and calling it wisdom. The parallel with Gideon is unmistakable for us today. Think about the last decade. Trump peeled back the curtain and exposed the hidden altars in white evangelical America. The COVID pandemic ripped the mask off and exposed the altars in institutional Christianity. The murder of George Floyd exposed the dark, bloody altars in American law enforcement. The resulting uprisings exposed the performative altars in liberal progressivism. The Capitol riot exposed the violent altars in conservative nationalism. Every single major event in recent history has been God, systematically, surgically revealing the idols we worship. And now, here we are facing the ultimate choice. Do we just rebuild these same idols under different brand names? Do we create new false gods and label them as social movements? Do we replace one charismatic strongman with another and fool ourselves into calling it progress? Or do we finally sit in the uncomfortable, terrifying silence of having no altar at all and learn to worship God directly without the mediation of corrupt systems we think we can control? That is the test of our time. That is the wilderness experience. That is the 40 years between the bondage of Egypt and the promise of Canaan. And the tragic truth is, most of us will fail this test. Most of us are going to die in this wilderness because we simply cannot let go of the gods we packed in our suitcases when we left Egypt. We will complain about the manna God provides. We will look back and romanticize the bondage because it was familiar. We will build golden calves the moment Moses stays on the mountain a little too long for our liking. We will rebel and spit on the leaders God raises up because they don't look like the polished image we expected or speak the way we want. We will refuse to enter the promised land because the giants look too big and we feel too small in our own eyes. And God will let us wander in circles until we die just so the next generation can inherit what we were too afraid to receive. But listen, there is a remnant. There is always a remnant. Joshua and Caleb looked at those exact same giants. They scouted the exact same land. They heard the exact same negative report, but they came back with a completely different word in their mouths. Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. That is Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. They didn't say this because they were stronger physically. They said it because they actually believed God. They believed that the promise of the Creator outweighed the obstacle of the creature. They believed that their identity as God's chosen people mattered infinitely more than the size of the enemy standing in their way. They stood firm in the conviction that the 400 years of captivity were finally up, believing in their souls that the appointed time had officially arrived, and that no giant, no towering wall, and no fortified city could possibly halt what God had already decreed in the heavens. That is the true definition of the remnant. That is the spirit of the 300. That is the specific breed of generation that will cross over the Jordan and enter the promise. They will enter not because they are flawless or perfect in their walk, not because they have the right credentials or earthly qualifications, and certainly not because they hold the majority vote, but simply because when God commands them to shatter the clay jar, they shatter it without hesitation. When God says to tear down the high places and destroy the altar of Baal, they tear it down. When the voice of God instructs them to march around the impenetrable walls of Jericho, they lace up their boots and march. When God commands them to stand still in the face of impossible odds and witness the salvation of the Lord unfold, they plant their feet and stand immovable. When God says move, they move with precision. And when God says wait, they wait with patience because they understand that delay is not denial. That is the essence of radical obedience. That is the specific frequency of faith that inherits ancient promises. That is the kind of mountain-moving faith that builds nations from the ground up. That is the potent chain-breaking faith that shatters 400-year curses and establishes generational blessings that will outlive us all. And if you are watching this message right now and you feel a stirring in your chest, if something deep within your spirit is vibrating with recognition, if the torch hidden inside your earthen vessel is burning hotter than ever before, if the altar sitting in your MS backyard suddenly looks like the idol it truly is, and if the gods you have spent years defending suddenly feel like the very curse you have been blaming on the enemy, then realize this: you are one of the 300. You are part of the set-apart remnant. You are one of the chosen vessels God is raising up right now in this pivotal moment of 2026, in this specific season of exposure, to stand firm in the encroaching darkness with nothing but a torch concealed in a jar, waiting for the divine command to break it open. And when that command finally comes, when you hear that sound resonate in your spirit, when you know beyond all shadow of a doubt that the Kairos moment is now, you do not hesitate, you break the jar, you let the hidden fire blaze forth. You blow the trumpet with all your lung capacity, you shout a war cry for the Lord, and you stand back and watch the camp of Midian descend into absolute panic. You watch the very systems that sought to oppress you turn their weapons on themselves. You watch the enemies that coordinated secret meetings against you fracture into chaos and infighting. You watch the empire that seemed so untouchable and invincible reveal its deep structural instability. You watch the false gods that demanded your constant worship prove to the world that they were powerless, mute, and deaf all along. And the miracle is, you do not even have to lift a sword. You do not have to fire a single shot. You do not have to match their level of violence or hatred. You just shine. You just expose the darkness. You just speak the unadulterated truth. You just live unapologetically free. And let me tell you, true freedom is the most dangerous and disruptive weapon in the entire world. Because freedom is undeniably contagious. Freedom spreads like wildfire. Freedom inspires the hopeless. And when the Midianites look up and see 300 truly free people, they do not just see a small group. They see 300,000. They see a massive army. They see an existential threat. They see the inevitable end of their reign of terror. And in their fear, they destroy themselves trying to stop a victory that has already been won in the spirit. That is the divine blueprint. That is the ancient pattern. That is the prophetic template God has been revealing to us through the story of Gideon, through the disruption of Trump, and through every single flawed leader he has raised up to expose the systems we foolishly thought were permanent fixtures. Let us be clear, Trump is not the savior. He never was the Messiah. He is the wrecking ball. He is the sledgehammer in the hand of history. He is the jarring, chaotic, and divisive force that had to arrive on the scene to break the illusion of stability, to shatter the clay jar of political decorum, so that the fire of hidden truth could finally be revealed to the masses. And we must admit, the fire that was revealed was ugly. It exposed rage and racism, it illuminated deep-seated conspiracy and violence, and it highlighted tribalism and idolatry in the church and the streets. But as ugly as it was real. And getting to what is real is exactly what we needed, because you cannot heal a wound that you refuse to acknowledge exists. You cannot repent of a sin that you will not name. You cannot tear down a stronghold that you refuse to see. And that disruption made us see whether we wanted to look or not, whether we were spiritually ready or not. Whether it broke our hearts, radicalized our minds, woke us up, or sent us spiraling into deep denial, he forced us to look in the mirror, and now in 2026 we have to decide what we are going to do with what we saw. Do we try to glue the jar back together? Do we attempt to go back to a normal that no longer exists? Do we pretend the fire isn't burning? Or do we accept that the breaking was necessary, that the exposure was ordained by God? That the chaos was actually the birth canal, and that the only way forward is through the fire. We must go through the wilderness, we must press through the tension, we must navigate through the deep discomfort of not having a familiar altar to worship at, through the vulnerability of holding a raw flame in the open air where everyone can critique it. We must push through the risk of shining our light when shining makes you a primary target. We must walk through the obedience of being one of the 300 when the other 31,700 decided to pack up and go home. Because historically and biblically, that is exactly what happened. Gideon started his campaign with 32,000 men, but God spoke and said, "You have too many people. Tell everyone who is fearful and afraid to go home." And 22,000 walked away. That is 2/3 of the entire army. 2/3 chose their fear over their faith. 2/3 chose the comfort of safety over the risk of obedience. And even then God said, "You still have too many for me to get the glory." So he took the remaining 10,000 down to the water to test them, telling Gideon to observe specifically how they drank. Most of them abandoned readiness, knelt down, and buried their faces in the water. But 300 men cupped the water in their hands and brought it up to their mouths, keeping their eyes on the horizon, staying alert, remaining vigilant even while they refreshed themselves. And God said, "These are the ones I can use, these 300. Not because they are morally better, but because they stayed ready for war. Because even in the moment of relief, even in the moment of necessary rest, they did not drop their guard for a second. They did not assume they were safe just because they were at the river. They did not relax into a spirit of complacency. That is the mark of the remnant. The ones who stay ready no matter the season. The ones who remain spiritually vigilant. The ones who have mastered the ability to rest and watch simultaneously. The ones who can drink from the river of culture without drowning in the river of culture. The ones who can exist in the world without becoming of the world. The ones who can navigate the corrupt systems without bowing down to worship the systems. The ones who can code switch to survive without losing their divine code. The ones who can survive the wilderness without making survival their entire identity. Those are the 300, and that is who God is calling you to be. If you are still locked in here with me, if you have endured this far without tuning out, getting offended, or scrolling away in disbelief, then realize something profound: you might just be part of the remnant. Or perhaps deep down in your spirit you are trembling with a holy kind of terror. You might feel exactly like Gideon did, crouched low in that wine press, threshing wheat in the dark. You are just trying to keep your head above water, trying to feed your family, and trying to stay invisible, while the modern-day Midianites siphon off every ounce of wealth and culture you build. Then suddenly the angel of the Lord speaks over your life, calling you a mighty man of valor. And your immediate reaction is to look over your shoulder and think, "Lord, surely you have dialed the wrong number." You start listing your resume of failures. "I am not qualified for this revolution. I am not ready for the front lines. I am paralyzed by fear. I am too broken. I am too young, or I am way too old. I lack the degrees. I lack the funds. I have too much trauma. I have compromised too many times." But the Most High looks at you and says, "I know all of that. That is precisely the reason I selected you out of the multitude. Here is why: when you finally submit to the call, when you tear down your father's idols, when you smash that clay jar and stand shoulder to shoulder with the 300, no man on earth will be able to claim it was your intellect or muscle that won the day. The world will be forced to point a finger at the heavens and say, 'That was God.' That is the definition of grace. That is the absolute scandal of the kingdom message. This is the specific method the Creator uses. He takes the foolish things of this world to completely baffle the wise, and he takes the weak things to utterly humiliate the strong. That is exactly why he tapped Gideon, a fearful man hiding in a hole. That is why he anointed David, an overlooked shepherd boy who was seemingly too scrawny to even lift Saul's armor. That is why he commissioned Moses, a stuttering fugitive with a murder rap on his record. That is why he overshadowed Mary, an unmarried teenager from a backwater town. Look at Peter, a hot-headed fisherman who swore he didn't know Jesus 3 separate times. Look at Paul, a religious extremist who hunted down believers like sport. The pattern is undeniable. When the Most High uses fractured vessels to accomplish the impossible, the glory cannot be hijacked by human ego. It goes straight to the throne. All the credit belongs to Him. All the worship flows to Him. That is the entire strategy. That has always been the end game. You need to understand that deliverance is not a story about you. It is a story about God. True liberation is not just about black people finally getting a seat at the table or societal validation. It is about the Most High finally reclaiming His glory on the earth. Biblical justice is not just about us being proven right. It is about the Creator's righteousness being unveiled before the nations. This coming wealth transfer is not designed just so we can drive luxury cars. It is so the heathen nations witness that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a covenant keeper who never forgets a promise. It demonstrates that He sits as judge over the nations that have oppressed His chosen ones. He is the one who shatters the proud and elevates the humble from the dust. He is the one who fills the starving with abundance and sends the wealthy elites away with absolutely nothing. History proves that every single empire that dared to touch Israel collapsed into ruin. And make no mistake, every modern empire that has touched the descendants of Israel is destined for the same pile of ash. Only the kingdom that cannot be shaken will stand when everything else turns to dust. That is the final move on the chessboard. That is the Supreme Court verdict. This is the prophetic word vibrating through the spirit of Black America right now. Stop seeing yourselves as grasshoppers. You are the true Israel. You are the blood descendants of the enslaved, the ones promised deliverance after the 400 years of affliction. And hear me clearly, those 400 years are finished. The cosmic timer has hit zero. The prison sentence has been fully served. Right now, in 2026, the wealth is beginning to shift hands. The Babylonian systems are buckling. The false altars are toppling over. The pagan gods of this age are being exposed as frauds. The only question remaining is whether you are spiritually positioned to receive the inheritance that was promised to your bloodline. Are you prepared to walk out of this modern Egypt carrying great substance? Are you ready to march into the promised land, moving like conquerors? Or are you still thinking like refugees? Are you truly ready to operate as the head and no longer the tail? Are you ready to arise and shine because the clay jar is going to shatter whether you want it to or not? The idols are coming down whether you try to protect them or not. The empire is dissolving regardless of your readiness. The Most High's timeline does not pause for your convenience. It does not wait for your signed permission slip. It does not wait until you feel good enough. The Spirit is moving. You either catch the wind and move with it, or you get left behind in the wilderness to die with the generation that believed the giants were bigger than the promise. So the decision is laid out before you. You can be Gideon, or you can be the fearful men who packed up and went home. You can be Joshua, or you can be the 10 spies who saw themselves as insects. You can stand with the 300 or blend in with the 31,700 who lacked faith. You can be the generation that crosses the Jordan, or the generation that digs graves in the desert. Be the holy remnant that smashes the idols, or be the majority that defends the system until the millstone is cast into the sea. Understand this: there is no gray area left. There is no neutral ground. You cannot straddle the fence when the fence itself is engulfed in flames. You are either shattering the jar to reveal the light, or you are hiding the torch. You are either blowing the shofar of war, or you are covering your ears to ignore the sound. You are either surrounding the enemy camp with the fire of God, or you are shivering in the darkness of the winepress. Whatever path you select today will dictate not just your future, but the destiny of your children and your grandchildren, echoing down through the generations. Because ultimately this narrative is not about you. It never was about you. This is about the resurrection of a chosen people, the vindication of the enslaved, the activation of a 400-year-old covenant, and a demonstration of divine justice to a world that has forgotten what justice looks like. It is the undeniable proof that oppression has a rigid expiration date, that empires have a shelf life, that every pharaoh eventually swallows water, that every Midian destroys itself, and every mystery Babylon eventually collapses. This is the season of God balancing the books. It is God keeping His word to the letter. It is God proving His identity. He is faithful, he is just, he is merciful, and he is patient, but his patience does not last forever. There comes a tipping point when patience transforms into judgment, when mercy shifts into wrath, when long-suffering becomes a reckoning. In 2026, we are standing squarely in that moment. So, if you felt a vibration in your spirit while hearing this message, if something locked deep inside you just cracked open, if the heat in your life has suddenly intensified to an unbearable degree, if the vessel you reside in feels like it is fracturing under pressure, and if the familiar idols sitting in your own backyard are suddenly exposed for the traps they truly are, then pay close attention. Consider this your burning bush moment. This is the Most High singling you out from the multitude, marking you as a member of the chosen 300 and identifying you as part of the holy remnant, the unlikely, the unqualified, the trembling, and the terrified deliverers who are next in line for greatness. He is positioning you right now in the year 2026 to stand firm in the deepest shadows and burn with such a ferocious intensity that the systems of Midian go into a panic, causing the enemy's camp to turn on itself and self-destruct. In the end, the Creator secures all the glory, and his captive children walk out of the dungeon into total and absolute liberation. And when the world looks at you baffled and asks how you made it over, how you flourished while the economy collapsed, how you walked out with spoil and wealth when the masses were still wandering in the spiritual wilderness, you have to be ready to speak. You tell them the truth about that night you went into the backyard of your ancestors' traditions and tore down the demonic altar, even when your own kinfolk threatened to disown you for touching their sacred cows. You tell them about the moment you shattered your own exterior, breaking the clay jar of self-preservation when everybody else was frantically trying to glue their broken pieces back together. You explain how you sounded the war trumpet when the majority remained silent in fear. You describe how you held the blazing torch of truth high when the crowd was scrambling for cover in the shadows. You look them in the eye and admit it wasn't me. It wasn't my grind, my degree, my slick business moves, or my high IQ. It was the Spirit of the living God. It was radical obedience when it didn't make sense. It was crazy faith. It was a willingness to look weak so he could display his power, and a willingness to look like a fool to the world so his wisdom could be established. I had to be broken down so he could make me whole. That is the testimony. That is the witness we bear. That is the blinding light that sends the camps of the oppressor into absolute chaos. Stop looking at your resume. It isn't your perfection, it is your obedience. It isn't your credentials, it is your willingness. It isn't your self-confidence, it is your reliance on him. If you can muster just a mustard seed of belief, the Almighty will utilize you to demolish strongholds, shatter containments, signal the alarm, and emancipate an entire nation from spiritual slavery. The power doesn't come because you are unique. It flows because he is sovereign. It is not about your muscle or political sway. It is about his omnipotence. You might not feel like a fighter today, but the moment you stop debating with the Creator and start executing his instructions, he transforms you into a warrior. The mandate is out. The clay vessels are shattering. The false idols are crumbling. The chosen 300 are rising up. And the systems of this world are about to find out exactly what happens when the people God promised to deliver finally decide to believe him. We do this for the King, but also for the generations coming after us who deserve an inheritance of liberty instead of chains, favor instead of curses, and the promised land instead of the wilderness. That is the specific reason we smash the container of our ego. That is why we dismantle the shrines of our comfort. This is why we burn bright. It is never for our own vanity. It is for their survival. For the eyes watching us from the crib, for the unborn waiting to enter, for the ones who need to stand on our shoulders to reach heights we could only dream of. Because we were the generation willing to draw a line in the sand. Finally, after 400 years of stolen harvests, breached contracts, deferred dreams, and Strange fruit on lynching trees, bodies on auction blocks, red-line neighborhoods, prison industrial complexes, medical apartheid, economic sabotage, and calculated systemic erasure. We said, enough. No more hiding our gifts in the wine press. No more protecting the altars that enslave us. No more bowing to the god of compromise. We are done serving the spirit of fear. We are done seeing ourselves as grasshoppers. We are done waiting for permission to exist. We are done accepting the crumbs from the table. No more tap dancing for approval. No more code switching into invisibility. No more barely surviving when our DNA is designed to reign as kings and queens. Enough is enough. God is impatient with your misery. He is poised to strike. The only variable in the equation is you. Are you prepared to be the vessel that cracks open so the holy fire can be seen? Are you ready to be the horn that blasts so loud the enemy camps go into hysteria? Are you willing to stand with the minority, 300, when hiding in the crowd of 32,000 would feel so much safer, so much cozier, and so much less controversial? The Gideon blueprint is fully laid out before you. The spiritual pattern is undeniable. The decision rests in your hands, and the clock is ticking.